Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I had been looking forward to this concert for weeks. The venue was an intimate underground club in Nashville's emerging East Side, the kind of place with a capacity of maybe 200 people, where you could feel the bass vibrating through the floorboards and see the sweat on the performers' faces from anywhere in the room. The band was on the cusp of breaking through, too big for dive bars, but not yet filling theaters. They had that raw energy that only exists before major labels and big productions polish away the rough edges. I'd been following them since their first EP dropped on Bandcamp, and their sound, a hypnotic blend of shoegaze and electronic elements with haunting vocals, had carried me through late nights of work and long drives along empty highways. The venue was packed that night, bodies pressed together in anticipation as the lights dimmed, and the stage came to life with vibrant colors and flashing beams. I had managed to secure a spot near the front, eager to be as close to the performance as possible. As the music began, I was completely immersed in the experience, the lights pulsing in rhythm with the bass, the crowd swaying as one organism, the lead singer's voice cutting through the wall of sound with emotional precision. It was everything I had hoped for, and for a while I lost myself in the moment, forgetting everything beyond the small universe created within those brick walls. However, about halfway through the set, I started to feel a strange sensation that something was off. It wasn't until I moved slightly to the side to avoid a particularly enthusiastic dancer that I noticed it. A flash of light from the corner of my eye caught my attention. When I turned, I saw a person holding a professional camera, its lens aimed directly at me. They were standing a few feet away, positioned perfectly to have a clear shot of me in the crowd. At first, I thought it was just a random photographer capturing the audience's reaction, not unusual at concerts where the venue or band might want footage for promotional materials. But then I shifted to another spot, a little further down the front row, and within moments, the same flash of light appeared. The photographer had adjusted their position and was still pointing the camera at me, not at the band or the crowd in general. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice or care. The music continued to wash over the audience, but my enjoyment had been punctured by this unsettling observation. I moved again, this time walking toward the back of the venue where it was less crowded. The same person appeared a minute later, camera in hand, capturing more images as I moved through the crowd. This was no longer just random photography. This person was following me specifically, documenting my movements throughout the venue. My heart began to race, and a wave of anxiety washed over me. Was I imagining things? Was I being paranoid? I considered confronting the photographer, but wasn't sure what I would even say. "Why are you taking pictures of me?" Seemed like a strange question to ask in the middle of a concert where photos were being taken everywhere. Yet the targeted nature of their behavior felt undeniably invasive. I decided to step outside for a moment, hoping the fresh air would clear my head and provide some perspective. I walked through the narrow corridor that led to the back exit. But as soon as I opened the door, I saw the photographer standing just outside. They hadn't followed me immediately, but had somehow anticipated where I would go. Their camera was raised, ready to capture yet another shot. This was too much to be coincidence. I ducked back inside quickly and made my way to the bar, where the staff were busy serving drinks to concert goers. I asked the bartender if they knew about an official photographer at the event, but they only shrugged, mentioning that several press people had been given passes for the show. "Any reason you're asking?" they questioned, noticing my distress. "Someone seems to be following me around, taking pictures," I explained. "Just me, not the crowd or the band." The bartender looked concerned, but didn't have much advice beyond suggesting I stay in the more populated areas of the venue where security staff were present. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out my next move, when I spotted the photographer near the entrance to the bathrooms. This time, they didn't raise their camera, instead watching me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I approached one of the security guards near the stage and explained the situation. He was attentive, asking for a description of the person and promising to keep an eye out. Within minutes, he had spoken to another guard, and they began moving through the crowd, scanning for the photographer I had described. For the remainder of the show, I stayed close to the security staff, finding some comfort in their presence. The photographer seemed to have disappeared, or at least they were no longer openly tracking me with their camera. I tried to recapture some of the joy I had felt earlier, but the experience had been tainted by fear and confusion. As the band played their final encore and the lights came up, I made sure to leave with a group of other concert goers, not wanting to find myself alone. The security guard who had helped me earlier offered to walk me to my car, which I gratefully accepted. "Did you find that person?" I asked as we crossed the parking lot. "We spotted someone matching your description," he replied. "Asked to see their press credentials. They showed something that looked legitimate enough, but when we questioned why they were focusing on audience members rather than the band, they got defensive and left shortly after." I thanked him for his help and drove home, constantly checking my rearview mirror to ensure I wasn't being followed. The drive felt longer than usual, each shadow on the road, transforming into potential threats in my anxious state. The next morning, while scrolling through social media to see posts about the concert, my blood ran cold. On the band's official page, someone had uploaded photos from the show. Among them was a picture of me standing near the stage, clearly visible and identifiable. The caption was a simple question. "Who is this?" I froze, staring at my own face on the screen. It wasn't a photo I had seen being taken, not one of the obvious shots from the photographer who had been following me. This had been captured from a different angle, earlier in the night, before I had even noticed anything unusual. I immediately reported the photo to the social media platform and contacted the band through their website, explaining what had happened both with the photographer and now with this posted image. To their credit, the band's manager responded within hours, apologizing profusely and assuring me they had not authorized anyone to post audience photos with identifying captions. They removed the image and promised to investigate who had access to their social media accounts. But the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been targeted. that someone had singled me out among hundreds of concert-goers for reasons I couldn't understand. Had it been random, or was there something more sinister behind it? I began researching similar incidents and discovered unsettling accounts of people being photographed without consent at public events. Their images later appearing on obscure websites or being used for purposes they never agreed to. In some cases, these photos were the first step in more serious stalking behavior. The incident changed how I attended live events. I became more cautious, always aware of my surroundings and who might be watching. I avoided standing in the same spot for too long and made sure friends knew where I was going. I started wearing less distinctive clothing and keeping my face partially obscured with hats or scarves when possible. It was a harsh lesson in how quickly a joyful experience could turn unsettling, how vulnerability could find you even in a crowd of people sharing the same passion. The photographer, whoever they were and whatever their intentions, had stolen something from me that night. The simple pleasure of losing myself in music without fear or suspicion. I still attend concerts, still support the artists I love, but always with one eye on the crowd, searching for the glint of a camera lens focused too intently in my direction. Sometimes the things we should fear aren't loud or obvious. Sometimes they're just a quiet click and flash in a darkened room, documenting our existence without permission or explanation. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I had been working at the luxury hotel in downtown Chicago for a few months when it happened. The job was straightforward enough. I cleaned rooms, made beds, and replaced toiletries, all while maintaining the friendly demeanor expected in five-star hospitality, even when guests were difficult or dismissive. I didn't mind the work. It paid reasonably well, offered decent benefits, and the prestige of the establishment meant generous tips from business travelers and wealthy tourists. After bouncing between temporary positions for years, this felt like stable ground, a place I could potentially build a career with advancement opportunities. It was early in the morning, just after my shift began at 6 a.m., when I was assigned to clean one of the premium suites on the 32nd floor. The previous guest had checked out the night before, and the room needed to be prepared for a new arrival, expected that afternoon. I gathered my supplies, fresh linens, toiletries, cleaning agents, and headed to the service elevator. The hotel was quietest at this hour, most guests still asleep or just beginning to stir. The hallways were hushed, the only sounds the occasional distant conversation or the soft hum of the ventilation system. I knocked on the door of suite 3217 lightly, following protocol before slipping my keycard into the slot. The door opened smoothly, and I wheeled my cart inside, ready to begin my routine. The moment I stepped into the room, I sensed something was wrong. The air felt unusually still and heavy, as if the oxygen had been slowly siphoned away during the night. A strange tension seemed to hang in the space, almost palpable against my skin. At first, I thought the room was empty, just as it should have been after checkout. But as my eyes adjusted to the dimness, the blackout curtains were still drawn, I realized I wasn't alone. A man stood in the center of the suite's living area, completely motionless. His back was straight, arms hanging at his sides, facing away from me toward the windows, though the curtains prevented any view of the cityscape beyond. He was dressed in a dark suit that looked expensive, but slightly rumpled, as if he'd been wearing it for days. I froze, unsure how to proceed. Had the front desk made a mistake? Was this the previous guest who hadn't actually checked out? Or perhaps an early arrival who had somehow gained access to the room before the official check-in time? I cleared my throat softly, intending to apologize for the intrusion and withdraw immediately. Hotel policy was clear about encountering occupied rooms: apologize, exit, report to management. The man didn't react at all, didn't turn or acknowledge my presence in any way. He remained perfectly still, as if he were a statue placed deliberately in the center of the room. "Excuse me, sir," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "I'm sorry to disturb you. There must have been a mix-up at the front desk." Still no response. Not even the slightest shift of weight or tilt of the head to indicate he'd heard me. A wave of unease washed over me. Something about this situation felt deeply wrong. I took a step back toward the door, my hand instinctively reaching for the handle behind me. "Sir, are you all right?" I tried once more, concern now mixing with my growing apprehension. Slowly, with an unnatural fluidity, the man turned his head, just his head, until he was looking at me over his shoulder. His body remained facing forward, creating an impossible angle that sent a shiver of horror through me. His face was blank, expressionless, with eyes that seemed too dark and empty to be real. They weren't focusing on me, but rather through me, as if I were transparent or not fully present in his reality. I stood paralyzed, unable to move or speak as we locked gazes across the dim room. The silence stretched between us like a physical thing, growing more oppressive with each passing second. Then, with the same eerie smoothness, he turned his head back to its original position, once again facing the curtained windows as if I had never been there at all. My training and professionalism momentarily forgotten, I backed out of the room, pulled the door shut behind me, and leaned against the wall in the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to make sense of what I'd just witnessed, to rationalize the unnatural movement and the vacant stare. Perhaps he was intoxicated, or under the influence of something that affected his motor functions. Maybe he had some medical condition I wasn't familiar with. There had to be a logical explanation for behavior that seemed to defy the natural limitations of the human body. I took a few deep breaths to steady myself before heading to the house phone at the end of the hallway. I called the front desk, explained that room 3217 was still occupied, and asked for clarification. The receptionist sounded confused. "That can't be right," she said. "Mr. Harrington checked out last night at 11:23. The room should be vacant." "Well, there's definitely someone in there," I replied, trying to keep my voice professional despite my lingering unease. "A man in a dark suit." There was a pause on the line before she responded. "I'll send security up to check. Wait at the elevator bay, please." I did as instructed, standing near the elevators and watching the corridor that led to suite 3217. Within minutes, 2 security officers emerged from a staff elevator and approached me. I recounted what I had seen, though I hesitated to describe the unnatural head rotation or the emptiness in the man's eyes, afraid they would dismiss me as hysterical or imaginative. I simply said there was a non-responsive man in the room who hadn't acknowledged me when I spoke to him. The senior officer nodded. "We'll check it out. Please wait here." They proceeded down the hallway, and I watched as they knocked on the door of 3217, announced themselves, and then used a master key to enter after receiving no response. For several long minutes, I stood waiting, expecting them to emerge with the mysterious man in tow, perhaps explaining that he was a confused guest who had wandered into the wrong room or a friend of the previous occupant who had been left behind. When the security officers finally returned, they were alone. "The room is empty," the senior officer said, his expression neutral, but his eyes scrutinizing my face as if looking for signs of deception or instability. "No one's in there. We checked the bathroom, closets, under the bed, nowhere someone could hide." I stared at them in disbelief. "That's impossible." I saw him clearly, standing right in the middle of the room. The officers exchanged glances. "Ma'am, there's no one there now. The room looks untouched since housekeeping last serviced it yesterday." But I began to protest, then stopped. What could I say? That I had seen a man whose head rotated independently from his body. That would certainly end with me being sent home for rest, and possibly never being scheduled again. Maybe he left while I was calling the front desk, I suggested weakly, though I knew this was impossible. I had been staring directly at the door to 3217 from the house phone, and no one had exited. The security officers suggested I take a break before continuing my shift, clearly doubting what I had reported, but professional enough not to say so directly. I nodded, mumbling agreement, and headed to the staff break room. For the remainder of my shift, I avoided the 32nd floor entirely, swapping assignments with another housekeeper who was happy to take the premium suite in exchange for 2 standard rooms on the 24th floor. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the man's unnaturally rotated head and empty eyes. I searched online for medical conditions that might explain what I had seen, but found nothing that matched the fluid, mechanical quality of his movement. The next morning, I arrived for my shift with trepidation, half expecting to be called into management's office and questioned about my reliability. Instead, I found the housekeeping department buzzing with a strange tension. Amelia, who had taken my place cleaning suite 3217, was absent. The supervisor mentioned tersely that she had called in sick, which was unusual for her. She hadn't missed a day in 3 years. When I texted her to check if she was okay, her response was brief and unsettling. "Don't go in that room again." Not ever. I never saw Amelia at the hotel again. She didn't return for her next shift, or the one after that. Her locker was cleaned out the following week, and a new housekeeper was hired to replace her. Management never mentioned the incident with room 3217 to me, and I didn't bring it up. The room continued to be booked and serviced, though I noticed it was always assigned to the newer staff members who wouldn't question the rotation. 3 weeks later, while on break, I overheard 2 maintenance workers discussing a strange complaint from a guest in suite 3217. Something about feeling watched during the night, about waking to find a man in a dark suit standing motionless at the foot of the bed, vanishing when the lights were turned on. I requested a transfer to the day shift shortly after and was fortunate enough to be accommodated. I still work at the hotel, but I've never returned to the 32nd floor, and I've never again mentioned what I saw that morning. Sometimes, though, when the elevator stops at floor 32 to admit or discharge passengers, I catch a glimpse of that long corridor before the doors close again. And sometimes, just for a moment, I think I see a dark figure standing at the far end, perfectly still, waiting for someone to approach. I always look away before it can turn its head. It started innocently enough, like any other winter evening in my Seattle apartment. I was curled up on my sofa, half watching a nature documentary about deep-sea creatures, while scrolling through design inspiration for an upcoming client project. Outside, January rain tapped steadily against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop to an otherwise ordinary Thursday night. That's when my phone rang. The screen displayed a number I didn't recognize, not unusual in itself, as I often received calls from clients using different lines or from colleagues at new numbers. I answered without much thought, expecting perhaps a last-minute work request or a friend calling from an unfamiliar phone. The line was silent at first, and I was about to hang up when a strange voice crackled through. It was distorted and unnatural, as if being filtered through some kind of voice modulator. The words were faint initially, but I could make them out clearly enough to feel a chill crawl up my spine. "You were at Evergreen Coffee yesterday, weren't you? You ordered the cardamom latte and sat by the window with your gray laptop bag." My heart seemed to skip a beat. I had indeed been at that exact cafe the previous day, ordered that exact drink, and sat in that specific location with my messenger bag. I hadn't posted anything about it online. I hadn't told anyone about my impromptu coffee stop. It had been a completely spontaneous decision made during my lunch break, when I'd needed to escape the confines of my home office. The voice didn't continue for long, just a few more cryptic words before the call ended abruptly. "The blue scarf suits you. You should wear it more often." I sat there staring at my phone, the documentary completely forgotten. The blue scarf was new. I'd purchased it over the weekend and worn it for the first time yesterday. How could anyone know these details? I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to an automated message saying the number was not in service. I checked my call history to make sure I hadn't imagined it, but there it was, a 37-second call from an unknown number. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps it was someone from the coffee shop, an employee with access to my name through my credit card payment, who had somehow obtained my number. But that didn't explain how they knew about the scarf, or why they would call in the first place. Maybe it was a friend playing an elaborate prank, though none of my friends would disguise their voice so disturbingly or play such an invasive joke. I put the phone down and tried to focus on the documentary again, but my mind kept circling back to the call. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably nothing sinister. Strange, yes, but not necessarily threatening. The next morning, I was walking to the grocery store when I noticed a woman in a bright yellow raincoat pass by me. As she did, I could have sworn I heard her mention evergreen coffee. I couldn't make out the exact words, but it was enough to make me turn my head in confusion. She continued walking, speaking into her phone as if she hadn't noticed me at all. It was probably just a coincidence. That cafe was popular in the neighborhood, still coming right after the unusual call. It made my stomach knot uncomfortably. I tried to push it out of my mind as I shopped for groceries and headed home. The day went by normally, filled with work and routine tasks that temporarily distracted me from the strange occurrences. Then that evening, my phone rang again. The same unknown number. This time the message was shorter, the voice just as electronic and unsettling. I saw you at Volunteer Park last Friday. You were reading The Memory Police on the bench by the pond. The one near the cherry trees. I nearly dropped the phone. I had indeed been at that park, reading that exact book on that specific bench. Again, it wasn't something I had shared on social media or mentioned to anyone. It had been a private moment of solitude after a stressful week of project deadlines. My hands trembled as I ended the call. I was no longer just confused. I was genuinely frightened. This wasn't coincidence or imagination. Someone was watching me, tracking my movements with alarming precision. I began feeling like I was losing my mind. I tried to think rationally. Perhaps I had a stalker, though that thought provided little comfort. Perhaps someone I knew was playing an elaborate and cruel prank. Or perhaps there was a more mundane explanation that I was simply too panicked to see. The calls kept coming every few days, each one recounting a new place I had visited or something I had done. The electronic voice would mention grocery stores I'd shopped at, restaurants where I'd eaten, even the movie theater where I'd watched a film alone the previous weekend. You looked sad at the Symphony Hall on Saturday night. Was it the Tchaikovsky or something else? The green sweater you bought at Nordstrom. Did you know the cashier was watching you the entire time? I noticed you picked up takeout from Bai Tong Thai last night. The dumplings are their specialty. Aren't you glad you ordered them? Each call lasted only seconds, never long enough to trace. Each came from a different number that would be disconnected immediately afterward. I became increasingly paranoid. I began to feel like I was being watched every time I left my apartment. I scanned crowds for anyone paying too much attention to me, checked for unusual cars parked near my building, even examined my belongings for tracking devices. But I found nothing concrete, no explanation for how this person knew my every move. I confided in a few close friends, but none of them seemed to understand the severity of what was happening. One suggested I change my phone number, but the calls came regardless, as if the person always knew how to reach me. Another suggested I block the unknown numbers, but they never used the same one twice. I started to feel isolated, as if I couldn't trust anyone around me. Even my closest friends became potential suspects in my increasingly paranoid mind. Then came the day I received a voicemail with no words, just the sound of heavy breathing. I deleted it immediately, my hands shaking too badly to hold the phone properly. Later that night, another call came through, still breathing, but now with faint rustling in the background, like someone moving through underbrush or dry leaves. I finally decided to take this seriously. The next day, I went to the police station and reported everything, the calls, the specific details the voice knew about me, the timeline of events. The officer listened attentively, taking notes as I spoke. She seemed concerned, but explained that without direct threats, there was little they could immediately do beyond documenting the harassment. But they're tracking me, I insisted. They know everywhere I go. She gave me practical advice. Vary my routine, stay in public places, keep a detailed log of any further contact, and consider speaking with a private investigator who specialized in stalking cases. She assured me they would check the numbers, though she warned that anonymous calling apps made tracing the real source difficult. I followed her advice, changing my daily patterns completely. I took different routes to work, shopped at new stores, and made sure I was never truly alone in public. I kept my phone with me, but activated call forwarding so that only recognized numbers would ring through. For a while, it seemed to work. The calls stopped, or at least they no longer reached me. Days passed, then a week, and I began to breathe easier. Perhaps whoever it was had grown bored with their sick game, or maybe the police involvement had scared them off. Then one evening, as I was walking home, a man in a gray coat passed by me on the sidewalk. As he did, he said in a perfectly normal voice, not electronic, not disguised, "The burgundy blouse was a good choice today." I stopped dead in my tracks, but by the time I turned around, he had disappeared around a corner. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might burst through my chest. I ran the remaining 2 blocks to my apartment building, fumbling with my keys at the entrance. Once safely inside, I called the detective assigned to my case. She promised to check security cameras in the area and advised me to stay with a friend for a few days. I packed a bag and went to my sister's place across town, not telling anyone else where I would be. A week later, the police contacted me with a shocking update. They had tracked the numbers and discovered they were all linked to an app that specializes in anonymous calling. But all the calls had originated from my apartment building's IP address. Further investigation revealed that one of my neighbors, a quiet man who lived 2 floors above me, had been using the building's shared Wi-Fi to make the calls. They found evidence on his computer of an elaborate surveillance operation. He had placed miniature cameras in the cafe I frequented near my usual park bench, and even in some of the stores I regularly visited. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed log of my daily movements stretching back 8 months, long before the calls had started. He had been watching me silently all that time, learning my habits, before deciding to make his presence known through those terrifying calls. When they arrested him, he offered no resistance and no explanation. He simply said he liked to observe people, and that I had an interesting pattern. The detectives told me he had files on several other residents in the building as well, though I was the only one he had contacted directly. The man was charged with stalking and illegal surveillance. I was granted a restraining order, though it felt like cold comfort given how thoroughly he had invaded my privacy. In the months that followed, I moved to a new apartment in a different neighborhood with much tighter security. I changed my phone number, altered my routines, and became much more cautious about my digital footprint. The fear gradually subsided, replaced by a vigilance that I suspect will never fully leave me. Sometimes when my phone rings and I don't recognize the number, I still feel that initial jolt of panic. I I still catch myself scanning rooms for hidden cameras or looking over my shoulder when walking alone. I've learned that privacy is far more fragile than most people realize, and that someone who wants to watch you badly enough will find a way. The experience changed me fundamentally. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the countless ways we inadvertently reveal our patterns to the world. But I refuse to let fear control me completely. I still go to cafes, still read in parks, still live my life, just with open eyes and the knowledge that sometimes, when it feels like you're being watched, you're not just being paranoid. Sometimes someone really is watching. I had been renting out a spare room in my apartment for a few months to help cover the rent in San Francisco's absurdly expensive housing market. It was an idea that seemed practical at the time, a way to make extra income while also getting a bit of company in a space that otherwise felt too empty for one person. I placed an ad on a popular roommate matching site, and within days had several responses. After careful vetting and in-person meetings, I chose someone who seemed like an ideal fit. A graduate student named Jamie, who needed a place to stay while sorting through his doctoral research. He was quiet, respectful, and seemed enthusiastic about the space. The references he provided checked out perfectly. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. Jamie kept to himself mostly, coming and going at regular hours for his classes and research at the university library. We exchanged pleasantries in passing, but otherwise gave each other plenty of space. He paid rent on time and was tidy in the common areas, everything I could have hoped for in a roommate. But gradually, I began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. He became more reclusive, spending longer periods in his room with the door firmly closed. At first, I attributed this to the natural ebb and flow of academic life. Perhaps he was in an intensive research phase or preparing for important presentations. After about 2 months, however, the shifts in his behavior became more concerning. He would emerge from his room only late at night or very early in the morning, seemingly trying to avoid any interaction. On the rare occasions when we did cross paths, he appeared uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact and giving one-word responses to my casual questions. I didn't press the issue. Everyone deserves privacy, and as long as he wasn't disruptive, his increasingly hermit-like behavior wasn't really my concern. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed dramatically in our living arrangement. One evening after returning from a dinner with friends, I passed by his closed door and heard what sounded like multiple voices, a conversation or perhaps a video call. Again, not unusual, except that one of the voices sounded distinctly like my own. I paused, listening more carefully. It was definitely my voice, specifically a phone conversation I'd had earlier that week while alone in my bedroom. I heard myself discussing plans with my sister about our mother's upcoming birthday, mentioning details about her gift and our family dinner. A cold wave of realization washed over me. There was no way Jamie could have heard that conversation unless he had been eavesdropping somehow, or worse, recording me. The next day, after he left for the university, I did something I'd never normally do. I entered his room. I told myself I was just checking for maintenance issues, but in truth, I was looking for evidence of surveillance equipment. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Hidden behind a row of books on his shelf was a small receiver connected to what appeared to be a recording device. Following the wiring led me to discover a tiny camera concealed within an air vent, positioned perfectly to capture my bedroom. My hands trembled as I examined the setup. This wasn't an impulsive invasion of privacy. It was a carefully planned surveillance operation. Multiple cameras had been strategically placed throughout the apartment, in the living room, kitchen, and most disturbingly, my bedroom and bathroom. I felt violated in ways I couldn't fully process. How long had he been watching me? What had he seen? What had he recorded? The questions made my skin crawl. I backed out of his room, trying to decide what to do next. Confronting him directly seemed risky. I had no idea how he might react if cornered. Calling the police seemed the obvious choice, but I hesitated, suddenly fearful of what evidence he might have already accumulated and where it might be stored. I retreated to a cafe several blocks away to gather my thoughts. After 2 cups of coffee and an hour of deliberation, I called a friend who worked in cybersecurity. Her advice was clear and immediate. Document everything, contact the police, and do not return to the apartment alone. I followed her guidance, taking photos of the cameras with my phone before calling the authorities. 2 officers arrived promptly and accompanied me back to the apartment. They documented the surveillance equipment and took a formal statement. Their professionalism provided some comfort, but the sense of violation remained overwhelming. Jamie returned while the police were still present. His face registered shock, then a brief flash of anger before settling into a carefully composed expression of innocence. He claimed the equipment was for a research project on domestic behaviors, and insisted he had mentioned it during our initial interview, a blatant lie. The officers questioned him separately while I waited in the living room, surrounded by the hidden eyes I now knew had been watching me for weeks. When they returned, they informed me they had grounds to arrest him for illegal surveillance and invasion of privacy. As they led him out in handcuffs, Jamie maintained his facade of academic interest, continuing to insist it was all a misunderstanding. But the flash drive they found in his pocket, containing hundreds of videos, meticulously cataloged by date and activity, told a different story. The legal process that followed was exhausting but necessary. A restraining order was issued, and criminal charges were filed. His university was notified, and his academic standing was immediately suspended pending investigation. The most disturbing revelation came weeks later when forensic analysis of his computer revealed similar surveillance operations in 2 previous living situations. I wasn't his first victim, just the latest in a pattern of voyeuristic behavior that had escalated over time. In the aftermath, I couldn't continue living in that apartment. Every corner, every vent, every innocuous object now felt like a potential hiding place for watching eyes. I broke my lease, paying a penalty I could ill afford, and moved across the city to a studio apartment where I lived alone. For months afterward, I checked my new place regularly for cameras. I became hyper-aware of vents, smoke detectors, and electronic devices. I changed my online presence, locked down social media accounts, and became much more cautious about sharing personal information. The sense of vulnerability was slow to fade. Therapy helped me process the violation and gradually rebuild my sense of security. So did adopting a strict policy of conducting my own sweeps for surveillance devices in any new environment. Hotels, airbnbs, changing rooms. What once would have seemed paranoid now felt like necessary precaution. 2 years have passed since then. Jamie was convicted on multiple charges related to illegal surveillance and received a sentence that included jail time, probation, and mandatory counseling. The legal process brought some closure, but the experience fundamentally changed how I view privacy and personal space. I'm more careful now about who I allow into my life, especially when it comes to sharing living space. I'm vigilant about protecting my privacy in ways I never considered before. And I've gained a deeper appreciation for the sense of security that comes from truly feeling safe in your own home. Sometimes people ask why I'm so thorough about checking unfamiliar environments, or why I'm hesitant to use certain devices with cameras or microphones. I usually give a vague response. It's easier than explaining that I once discovered my everyday life was being secretly recorded and cataloged by someone I thought I could trust. The most important lesson I learned wasn't about surveillance technology or legal protections, though those are certainly important. It was about trusting my instincts when something feels wrong. That subtle sense that something had shifted in Jamie's behavior was my first warning, one I should have heeded sooner. I still believe in giving people chances, in opening my life to new connections. But I do so now with open eyes, aware that sometimes the threats to our privacy and security aren't elaborate hacking schemes or distant corporate surveillance. Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight, disguised as the person across the hallway. I had been searching for the perfect apartment for weeks, something simple and affordable in a quiet neighborhood of Boston. The city was thriving, but housing was scarce, and my modest budget as a first-year architectural associate limited my options considerably. When I walked into the rental on Commonwealth Avenue, the landlord was immediately warm and welcoming. The apartment was unexpectedly spacious, with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and large windows that filled the rooms with natural light. Most surprisingly, the rent was well within my budget, almost suspiciously reasonable for the neighborhood and square footage. I was sold almost immediately, brushing aside a few peculiarities that, in retrospect, should have given me pause. The first thing I noticed was the mirrors. There was one on nearly every wall. A large ornate mirror hung in the living room, another in the hallway, one in the bedroom, and even one in the bathroom. At first, I thought it was an odd design choice, but not necessarily a deal breaker. I grew up in a house with plenty of mirrors, so the aesthetic didn't particularly bother me. What struck me as strange was how these mirrors seemed deliberately positioned to face inward, toward the living spaces, rather than placed to create the illusion of expanded rooms as designers typically arrange them. There were no windows in the bathroom or kitchen, just those reflecting surfaces mounted precisely where one might expect to find an opening to the outside world. The landlord, Mr. Brennan, noticed my gaze lingering on one particularly large mirror that dominated the living room wall. They're original to the building, he explained with a practiced smile. The mirrors are part of the historic character. The previous tenant actually requested we keep them all in place. I nodded, willing to accept this explanation. Boston was full of old buildings with architectural quirks, and the mirrors did give the space a unique character. If preserving them meant securing an affordable apartment in such a desirable location, I was more than willing to make that trade-off. I signed the lease that afternoon and moved in the following weekend. The first few days passed uneventfully as I unpacked and settled into my new home. I arranged my furniture, organized my books, and tried to make the space feel like my own. Yet something about the apartment never quite felt comfortable. The mirrors created an unsettling effect, reflecting my movements no matter where I stood, making it impossible to escape my own image. At night, I'd catch glimpses of my reflection moving from room to room, the mirrors creating an infinite regression of shadowy figures that seemed to follow just half a step behind me. I began to develop the habit of avoiding direct eye contact with my reflected self, irrationally concerned that something might be off, that the person in the mirror might not match my movements exactly. By the end of the first week, I started noticing something odd about the quality of the reflections. The mirrors didn't seem to reflect light the way they should. They appeared slightly darker than normal, as if viewing the room through a faintly tinted glass. Objects and furnishings seemed just a shade different than they appeared in real life, colors slightly muted, edges less defined. I tried to rationalize these observations. The mirrors were old, likely made with different materials than modern ones. Perhaps the glass had developed imperfections over time, or the silver backing had deteriorated in patches. But this explanation didn't quite satisfy the growing unease I felt each time I passed by one of the reflecting surfaces. On the 10th night in the apartment, I woke suddenly at 3 in the morning. The room was dark, except for the pale blue glow of streetlights filtering through my curtains. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was staring directly at the large mirror mounted on the wall opposite my bed. Something was wrong. The reflection showed my bedroom, but it wasn't quite right. The angle seemed off somehow, as if the mirror was showing a perspective that didn't match the actual placement of objects in my room. My dresser appeared slightly farther from the bed than it actually was. The door to the hallway seemed wider, the opening revealing more of the corridor beyond than should have been visible from that angle. I sat up slowly, heart beginning to race. My reflection moved accordingly, but there was a barely perceptible delay, just a fraction of a second between my movement and that of my mirrored self. I raised my hand. The reflection raised its hand. I tilted my head. The reflection tilted its head. I frowned. The reflection frowned. But each time, that slight lag remained, as if the person in the mirror was watching and imitating me rather than truly reflecting my actions. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself I was still half asleep, that my mind was playing tricks in the liminal space between dreams and wakefulness. When I opened them again, everything seemed normal. The reflection aligned perfectly with reality, moving in exact synchronization with my movements. I lay back down, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from imaginary monsters. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, dismissing the incident as nothing more than a hypnagogic hallucination. The next morning, I convinced myself nothing unusual had happened. I went about my day, heading to the architectural firm where I worked, focusing on drafts and client meetings rather than mirrors and reflections. But when I returned home that evening, the apartment felt different, colder somehow, despite the mild September weather and functioning heating system. As I moved through the rooms, I began to feel as if I wasn't alone. The sensation wasn't like being watched from outside. It was more intimate than that, as if something was occupying the same space as me, moving when I moved, breathing when I breathed. I found myself avoiding looking directly into the mirrors, keeping my gaze averted as I passed by them. But peripheral vision can sometimes catch what direct sight misses, and more than once, I thought I saw movement in the reflective surfaces that didn't correspond to my own. A hand shifting position when mine was still. A head turning slightly when I faced forward. I began to spend less time in the apartment, working late at the office, and accepting any social invitation that would keep me away from home. When I did return, I covered the bedroom mirror with a sheet before sleeping, claiming to myself it was to prevent the streetlight's glow from disturbing my rest. 3 weeks after moving in, I woke again in the middle of the night. The sheet had fallen from the mirror or been removed, and moonlight streamed through a gap in the curtains, illuminating my reflection with an ethereal glow. Only it wasn't my reflection staring back at me. The figure in the mirror was definitely me, same features, same pajamas, but its expression was wrong. While I felt my face frozen in shock and growing terror, the reflection wore a faint smile, curious and almost amused. I scrambled out of bed, backing toward the bedroom door, unable to tear my gaze away from the mirror. The reflection moved with me, but maintained that incongruous expression, its eyes following me with an awareness that reflections shouldn't possess. Then it raised its hand and pressed its palm flat against its side of the glass. I fled the bedroom, rushing into the living room only to be confronted by my distorted image in the large mirror there. This reflection also moved independently, turning its head to track my movement across the room. In the hallway mirror, a third version of myself watched with the same unnatural interest. I was surrounded by these fragments of myself, each behaving as if possessed by something else, something that wore my appearance, but was fundamentally different. In a panic, I grabbed my keys and ran for the front door. As I fumbled with the lock, I caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway mirror. My reflection was no longer mirroring my actions at all. It had turned completely around and was walking toward the back of the reflected hallway, disappearing into a darkness that didn't exist in my actual apartment. I finally managed to open the door and stumbled out into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. I spent the remainder of the night in a 24-hour diner, nursing cups of coffee and trying to convince myself I had experienced some sort of waking nightmare. In the morning light, my fears seemed absurd, the product of an overactive imagination combined with stress and perhaps mild sleep deprivation. But I couldn't shake the image of my reflection moving independently, walking away into that impossible darkness. I returned to the apartment only long enough to pack an overnight bag, then booked a hotel room for the next few nights. I needed time to think, to decide whether I was experiencing something supernatural or simply having a psychological episode. After 2 days at the hotel, I worked up the courage to call my landlord. I asked innocuous questions about the building's history, hoping to uncover something that might explain my experiences. The apartment has always had those mirrors, Mr. Brennan confirmed. They were installed by the original owner in the 1920s. Some sort of European design trend, I believe. I hesitated before asking my next question. Has anyone ever complained about them? About anything strange happening with the mirrors? There was a long pause on the line. There have been some tenants who found them unsettling, he finally admitted. Most people get used to them. Some don't. That's why the rent is so reasonable. What exactly happens to the people who don't get used to them? I pressed. Another pause, longer this time. They leave, he said simply. Usually rather suddenly. Look, if you're having issues with the mirrors, I can't remove them. They're built into the walls in most cases, part of the structure. But I could let you out of your lease without penalty if you're uncomfortable. I accepted his offer immediately. The next day, I returned with 2 friends to help me move out. I half expected them to think I was overreacting, but to my surprise, both commented on the strange atmosphere in the apartment without my prompting. It feels like someone's watching us, my friend Elise said, glancing nervously at the living room mirror. And is it just me, or do these reflections look off somehow? The angles are wrong, agreed Marcus, who was himself an architect. These mirrors aren't positioned correctly for normal reflection. They're angled slightly inward, toward each other. It's as if they're designed to reflect each other rather than the rooms they're in. As we packed, I kept my gaze averted from the mirrors, focusing solely on the task at hand. But as I carried the last box toward the door, I couldn't resist one final glance at the living room mirror. My reflection stared back at me, its expression a perfect match for my own troubled face. But as I turned away, in my peripheral vision, I could have sworn I saw it smile and raise its hand in a small wave of goodbye. I moved into a new apartment the following week, one with considerably fewer mirrors. Those I couldn't avoid, like the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, I covered when not in use. My friends thought I had developed a strange phobia, and perhaps I had. 6 months later, curiosity got the better of me, and I drove past my old building. A for rent sign hung in the window of what had been my apartment. Apparently, the tenant who had moved in after me hadn't stayed long either. Sometimes I wonder about those mirrors, about what exactly they were reflecting. Not our world, I'm convinced of that now. Something else, somewhere else, populated by beings that look like us but aren't quite us. And sometimes, catching an unexpected glimpse of myself in a store window or car mirror, I still find myself wondering, which side of the glass am I really on? I needed a cleaner, more reliable source of income. After 6 months of freelance graphic design work with unpredictable paychecks and difficult clients, I was desperate for stability. So when a friend sent me a link to a job posting that matched my skills perfectly, I didn't hesitate to apply. The position was for a digital content designer at a mid-sized marketing firm in Houston. The salary was generous, the benefits comprehensive, and the company had excellent online reviews from both clients and employees. It seemed almost too perfect, but I was in no position to be skeptical of good fortune. The online application process was straightforward. Upload a resume, portfolio, and fill out a detailed questionnaire about my experience and skills. I spent an entire evening crafting my responses, making sure every answer showcased my capabilities, while aligning with the company's stated values of innovation and precision. 2 days later, I received an email inviting me for a first-round interview. The message came from a hiring manager named Gloria Chen, who explained that my application had stood out among the candidates. She provided a link to schedule a video call, which I eagerly selected for the following afternoon. When the time came, I sat at my desk wearing my most professional shirt, my apartment backdrop carefully curated to appear organized but creative. The video call connected, and Gloria appeared on screen, a woman in her 40s with sharp features and perfectly styled hair, wearing a crisp blazer with the company logo subtly embroidered on the lapel. "Thank you for joining us today," she began, her tone polished but warm. "We were very impressed with your portfolio and application responses." The interview progressed smoothly. Gloria asked insightful questions about my design process and how I handled creative challenges. She seemed genuinely interested in my responses, nodding appreciatively when I explained my approach to balancing client needs with effective visual communication. Near the end of our conversation, Gloria introduced what she called a standard personality assessment that all candidates were required to complete. "It helps us ensure not just skill fit, but culture fit as well," she explained. "You'll receive a link immediately after our call. It should take about 30 minutes to complete, and we'd like to have your responses within 24 hours. I agreed enthusiastically, thanking her for the opportunity. The interview ended on a positive note, with Gloria mentioning that a second-round interview would be scheduled pending the results of my assessment. True to her word, an email arrived moments after the video call ended. The link directed me to a sleek, professional-looking survey platform. The company logo featured prominently at the top of each page, lending legitimacy to what followed. The first few questions were standard fare for personality assessments. Do you prefer working independently or as part of a team? How do you typically respond to tight deadlines? Describe your ideal workspace environment. I answered thoughtfully, trying to present myself as adaptable and collaborative while remaining authentic about my working style. As I progressed through the assessment, however, the questions began to shift in tone and content. How often do you experience moments of déjà vu? Do you ever feel that your thoughts are not entirely your own? Have you noticed patterns in everyday life that others seem to overlook? These seemed unusual for a professional assessment, but I rationalized that they might be testing creativity or out-of-the-box thinking, qualities valuable in a design role. I answered honestly, admitting to occasional déjà vu and a designer's natural tendency to notice patterns. Then the questions became even stranger. When was the last time you felt you were being observed when alone? Have you ever experienced missing time, periods you cannot account for? Do you have recurring dreams of places you've never visited? A sense of unease began to creep through me. These questions had nothing to do with my professional qualifications or even general personality traits. They probed into deeply personal psychological experiences in a way that felt invasive and inappropriate for a job application. Still, I had come this far, and the opportunity seemed promising. I told myself that perhaps this was some innovative psychological approach to hiring, that companies were using increasingly sophisticated methods to build perfect teams. I continued answering, though more guardedly now. The final section of the assessment contained the most disturbing questions of all. Would you consent to participating in experimental research if it benefited the company? On a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable would you be with temporary memory alterations for project security purposes? Would you be willing to engage with alternative perception technologies as part of your creative process? Alarm bells were now ringing loudly in my mind. This was far beyond eccentric corporate culture. These questions suggested something fundamentally unethical. I closed the browser without completing the assessment, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I had just encountered. That evening, I received a text message from an unknown number. We noticed you didn't complete your assessment. Your responses thus far were quite promising. We encourage you to finish the process to remain in consideration. I didn't respond. Instead, I searched for more information about the company online. The website looked legitimate, with case studies, team photos, and client testimonials. But when I dug deeper, inconsistencies emerged. The company address led to an office building that had been vacant for months, according to local business listings. Their listed clients had no mention of this marketing firm in their own promotional materials or annual reports. Most disturbing of all, when I checked the professional networking profiles of the supposed employees, including Gloria Chen, I found that their work histories appeared manufactured. All had joined the company within the past year. All had suspiciously similar previous employment gaps, and none had connections to people outside the firm. I called my friend, who had sent me the job listing, to ask where he'd found it. He sounded confused. What job listing? I never sent you anything like that. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I checked my email again, looking for his original message. It was gone, not just moved to another folder, completely erased from my account. I searched my phone for text messages about the job, finding nothing despite my clear memory of discussing it with him. The next morning, my phone rang with a local number I didn't recognize. Hello, this is Gloria Chen calling to follow up on your assessment. We're still very interested in your candidacy and would like to schedule your second interview. I froze, unsure how to respond. I hadn't given them my phone number. I think there's been a mistake, I managed to say. I'm no longer interested in the position. There was a pause, just long enough to be uncomfortable. That's disappointing to hear, Gloria replied, her warm tone now noticeably cooler. We saw great potential in your profile. Are you certain you wish to withdraw? The second phase of the process is quite illuminating. Yes, I'm certain. Please remove my information from your database. Another pause. As you wish. Though I should mention that withdrawal at this stage is rather unusual. Most candidates find the process quite compelling once they've begun. I ended the call and immediately blocked the number. Then I began systematically changing all my passwords, enabling two-factor authentication on every account, and checking my credit reports for any suspicious activity. For several days, nothing happened. I started to believe that whatever strange rabbit hole I'd nearly fallen into was behind me. Then the dreams began. I would find myself in an office I'd never seen before. Pristine white walls, minimalist furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a cityscape that seemed somehow wrong, as if buildings had been rearranged or constructed at impossible angles. In these dreams, I was always sitting at a sleek desk, working on designs that shifted and moved in ways that defied the laws of physics and visual perception. And in each dream, Gloria Chen would appear, standing beside me, watching my work with those same sharp eyes, nodding appreciatively. "You're adapting wonderfully," she would say. The others didn't take to it nearly as quickly. I would wake from these dreams disoriented, with a splitting headache and the unsettling sensation that I had been gone much longer than a single night's sleep. After a week of these dreams, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "The position remains open." The message contained no text, just an attachment, a single image of an office lobby. It matched the one from my dreams perfectly, down to the abstract sculpture in the corner and the geometrically impossible staircase in the background. I deleted the email immediately and shut down my computer. When I turned it back on hours later, I found that all my design files had been altered. Subtle changes had been made to each project, elements moved slightly. Colors shifted to hues I hadn't selected. Strange symbols embedded almost imperceptibly in the negative space of my layouts. Panicked, I wiped my hard drive completely and reinstalled the operating system. I changed my phone number, created new email accounts, and even moved to a different apartment across town, telling no one my new address. 2 months passed without incident. I began to rebuild my freelance business, carefully vetting potential clients and working only with people I could meet in person. The dreams faded, and I convinced myself that I had escaped whatever strange organization had attempted to recruit me. Then yesterday, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a sleek company ID badge with my photo, a photo I had never posed for. It showed me smiling professionally against a white background, wearing a blazer I didn't own. The company logo matched the one from the original job listing, and underneath my image was my name and a job title, Senior Perception Designer. Attached was a handwritten note. "Your probationary period has been exemplary. We look forward to your formal onboarding next week. You won't remember sending in the rest of your assessment, but we assure you your answers were perfect. Welcome to the team. I haven't slept since the package arrived. I've called the police, but they seemed skeptical of my story, especially when the company's website disappeared from the internet, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. The officer suggested I might be experiencing stress-induced paranoia and recommended I speak with a mental health professional. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps this has all been some elaborate manifestation of anxiety about my financial situation and career path. But as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with my perception of reality. Occasional flashes in my peripheral vision suggest objects moving when I'm not looking directly at them. Moments of déjà vu have become so frequent that I sometimes lose track of whether I'm experiencing something for the first time or the 100th. And sometimes, when I'm designing, I find myself unconsciously creating images that shouldn't be possible, perspectives that shift when viewed from different angles, colors that seem to exist beyond the normal spectrum, patterns that appear to move subtly, even in static images. I look at these creations and don't recognize my own work. Or worse, I recognize it as exactly what the company was looking for in their assessment. The most terrifying thought of all is that perhaps I never did close that browser window. Perhaps I completed the assessment. Perhaps the second interview already happened. Perhaps I've been working for them all along. And these moments of clarity are simply glitches in whatever system they've used to alter my perception. Tomorrow is Monday. Part of me is afraid I'll wake up in that impossible office, sitting at that sleek desk, with Gloria Chen standing beside me, nodding appreciatively at work I don't remember creating. And part of me is afraid I've been there all along. I matched with someone online a few weeks before we met. His profile stood out immediately, thoughtful responses rather than the typical one-liners, photos that showed genuine interests instead of carefully staged poses, and a bio that reflected self-awareness without veering into pretentiousness. It started with a small, strange notification one morning. I had just finished my first cup of coffee when I checked my email and saw an alert about an attempted access to a secure building. The email listed my name and some specific details, but I had not been anywhere near that location, a corporate office complex in downtown Seattle. I immediately felt a strange sinking feeling in my stomach. I had no idea what this meant, but I assumed it was a mistake or some kind of phishing attempt. I deleted the message and continued with my morning routine, preparing for another day of remote work at my marketing firm. Later that afternoon, I received a call from the security team at my workplace. The voice on the other end was professional but concerned. "Ms. Lawson, we need to verify some information regarding your badge access today." I felt that same sinking feeling return. My badge access. I've been working from home all day. There was a pause on the line. Someone used your ID credentials to enter our downtown office this morning at 9:17 a.m. According to our logs, they accessed the 5th floor server room. We have security footage showing someone who doesn't appear to be you. My heart began to race. That's impossible. My ID badge is right here in my wallet. I reached for my purse and pulled out my wallet, flipping to the slot where I kept my company credentials. The badge was there, exactly where it should be. "Ms. Lawson, it appears someone has somehow duplicated your badge. The system registered your unique employee code." The implications hit me all at once. Someone had not only cloned my work ID, but was using it to access secure areas of my company's building. This wasn't a random phishing attempt. This was targeted identity theft with potentially serious consequences for my career and reputation. "I need to come in," I said, already gathering my things. "I haven't been in that building today, and I need to see this footage." When I arrived at the security office 45 minutes later, the head of corporate security, a former police officer named Darren Walsh, was waiting for me. His expression was grave as he led me to a small monitoring room lined with screens. "We've isolated the footage from this morning," he said, typing commands on a keyboard. This is the fifth-floor hallway leading to the server room. The video showed a nondescript corridor with keycard access doors. A figure walked into frame, face partially obscured by a medical mask and baseball cap, but dressed in professional attire similar to what I might wear to the office. They approached the door, held up what appeared to be a badge, and the door unlocked. "We've got a better angle from inside," Darren said, switching to another camera feed. This view showed the person entering the server room, removing their cap once inside to reveal a hairstyle remarkably similar to mine, same length, similar color. But even with the mask still on, I could tell this wasn't my face. The eyes were different, the posture wrong. "That's not me," I said, feeling both relieved that there was clear evidence of my innocence, and deeply disturbed that someone had gone to such lengths to impersonate me. "We know," Darren replied. "Your phone GPS data confirms you were at your home address all morning, and we can see this person doesn't match your physical description exactly. What concerns us is how they obtained a functioning copy of your badge and why they targeted you specifically." The video continued, showing the impersonator connecting something to one of the servers, a small device barely larger than a thumb drive. They worked quickly, with apparent knowledge of the system's layout, then replaced their cap and exited the way they had come. The entire operation took less than 3 minutes. "Do you have any idea who might want to do this?" Darren asked. "Anyone with a grudge against you or the company. Anyone who might benefit from accessing our systems." I shook my head, still struggling to process what I was seeing. "No, nothing like that. I can't imagine why anyone would target me specifically." But even as I said it, a troubling thought formed in my mind. 3 weeks earlier, I'd received a phishing email that had seemed unusually sophisticated, personalized with details about a project I was working on, appearing to come from our HR department. I hadn't clicked on the link, but I remembered thinking it was oddly specific. I mentioned this to Darren, who made a note, and said they would investigate further. The company's cybersecurity team was already analyzing what the device might have done to their systems, and they would be implementing new security protocols immediately. As I left the building, I felt unexpectedly vulnerable. The busy downtown street suddenly seemed filled with potential threats. Any face could belong to the person who had stolen my identity, who had somehow obtained enough personal information to convincingly impersonate me. I found myself scanning the crowds, searching for anyone who might be watching me too closely. That evening, I took precautionary measures, changing all my passwords, enabling two-factor authentication on every account, and placing fraud alerts on my credit reports. I slept poorly, waking at every small noise in my apartment. The next morning, I discovered a new credit card had been opened in my name at a bank I'd never used. According to the application details, someone with my social security number, address, and mother's maiden name had applied online and requested the card be sent to a temporary address, a P.O. box in a neighboring city. The bank's fraud department took my report seriously, immediately closing the account and launching an investigation. But the violation felt deeper than financial. Someone was systematically dismantling my identity, piece by piece, using it for purposes I couldn't begin to understand. The following days brought more disturbing revelations. A rental car had been leased in my name. My medical insurance had been billed for procedures I never received. My email address had been used to register domains associated with questionable content. Each discovery was another thread pulling loose from the fabric of my life. The police assigned a detective to my case after the company filed a formal report about the server room incident. Detective Marquez specialized in identity theft and cybercrime, and her assessment was blunt. "This isn't random," she explained during our first meeting. "The level of coordination and the specific targeting of your workplace access indicates this is someone who knows you or has been studying you for some time. They're not just after quick financial gain. They're systematically using your identity for something more complex." She asked detailed questions about my personal history, relationships, and professional connections. Had I noticed anyone paying unusual attention to me recently? Had I been in any conflicts at work or in my personal life? Did I have access to sensitive information that might be valuable to competitors? Nothing stood out until she asked about new people who had entered my life in recent months. That's when I remembered the dating app match, someone I'd been messaging with for a few weeks, but hadn't yet met in person. He had asked thoughtful questions about my work and life, showing particular interest in my role at the company. We had planned to meet for coffee the following weekend. Detective Marquez immediately requested access to these messages and had the dating profile investigated. The profile was sophisticated, a complete identity with consistent details across multiple platforms, built up over months. But when they dug deeper, the person didn't exist. The photos belonged to a European model, whose images had been subtly altered. The job history couldn't be verified. The phone number traced back to a burner phone purchased with cash. "This is extremely concerning," Detective Marquez said when she called with these findings. "This person has been systematically gathering information about you, likely for the specific purpose of this identity theft. I recommend you cancel your meeting and cease all contact immediately." I felt sick as I reviewed our conversation history with new understanding. What I had interpreted as genuine interest had been calculated information gathering. Questions about my childhood had been fishing for security question answers. Discussions about work had been mapping my access and knowledge of company systems. Even casual conversations about daily routines had been building a profile of my movements and habits. The police set up surveillance for the coffee shop where we had planned to meet, hoping the person would show up despite the abrupt communication cutoff. They did appear, a woman, not a man as the profile had suggested, watching the location from a parked car across the street. When officers approached, she fled, abandoning the vehicle, which turned out to be rented using another stolen identity. Inside the car, they found equipment for creating fake IDs, several phones, and a laptop containing files on multiple targets. I was just one of several people being systematically impersonated as part of what appeared to be a corporate espionage operation targeting several tech companies in the region. The investigation expanded significantly after this discovery, involving federal agencies and corporate security teams from multiple organizations. I was offered protection and support services, including identity monitoring and therapy, for the psychological impact of such a profound privacy violation. The full scope of the operation was never fully explained to me. Much of it became part of ongoing investigations into larger criminal networks. What I do know is that the person who stole my identity was never caught, though several associates were eventually arrested in connection with related crimes. In the aftermath, I had to rebuild my digital life from the ground up. New accounts, new passwords, new security measures. I changed my appearance, moved to a different apartment, and became far more cautious about sharing personal information, even with people I thought I could trust. The most insidious effect was the lingering sense that my identity, the collection of data, history, and credentials that represented me in modern society, was fundamentally vulnerable. It could be copied, manipulated, and misused, and there was very little I could do to prevent it entirely. I still use social media and dating apps, but with a heightened awareness of how each shared detail, each posted photo, each casual conversation might be weaponized by someone with malicious intent. I've become almost pathologically private in certain ways, while forcing myself to maintain enough normality to avoid letting the experience define my entire life. Sometimes I still find myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if I'm being watched, studied, mimicked. I examine new acquaintances with subtle suspicion, looking for inconsistencies or too perfect alignment with my interests. The carefree trust I once had has been replaced by a constant, low-level vigilance. The woman who stole my identity never got what she was ultimately after. Whatever data or access the company server held remained secure. But in many ways, she still took something irreplaceable. My sense of security, my belief that I was too ordinary to target, too careful to victimize. In a world where identity is increasingly digital, a collection of data points rather than ineffable personal qualities, none of us are as safe as we believe. Our lives can be copied, our personas duplicated, our most private details extracted and repurposed. And the most frightening part is that you might never know it's happening until someone else has already become you. I had been driving for the popular rideshare app for about 6 months, mostly on weekends and evenings after my day job. The extra income helped pay down my student loans, and I generally enjoyed meeting different people and exploring parts of Los Angeles I might never otherwise visit. Most of my rides were unremarkable, commuters heading to work, tourists visiting attractions, people going home after nights out. Passengers typically spent the journey scrolling through their phones or making small talk about traffic and weather. I developed a knack for gauging who wanted conversation and who preferred silence. It was a Friday night in November when I received a pickup request from an area in the Hollywood Hills. I just dropped off a couple at a restaurant in Los Feliz and was cruising slowly, waiting for my next assignment. The app indicated the passenger's name was Michael, with a perfect 5-star rating. The destination was set for an address in Venice Beach, not a short trip, which meant a decent fare. I navigated the winding roads up into the hills, following the GPS to a modern house perched on the edge of a cliff. The place was impressive, all glass and angles, dramatically lit against the night sky, with a view of the city sprawling below. It was the kind of home that appeared in architectural magazines or belonged to tech executives and entertainment industry elites. I pulled into the circular driveway and sent the standard notification that I had arrived. Almost immediately, the front door opened, and a man emerged, walking briskly toward my car. He appeared to be in his early 40s, dressed in expensive-looking casual clothes, dark jeans, and a lightweight sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His hair was salt and pepper, perfectly styled despite the late hour. He slid into the backseat, offering a curt evening before immediately focusing on his phone. I confirmed his name and destination, then pulled away from the house, navigating back down the winding road toward the main boulevard. For the first 10 minutes, we drove in silence. This wasn't unusual. Many passengers preferred to avoid conversation, especially during longer rides. The man, Michael, seemed absorbed in whatever he was doing on his phone, occasionally typing rapidly, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. We were approaching the 101 freeway when he finally spoke. "Change of plans," he said abruptly. "I need to make a stop first." "No problem," I replied. "If you update the destination in the app, I'll follow the new route." There was a pause. "I'd rather not use the app for this. Just take Barham to Forest Lawn, then head west. I'll direct you from there." Something about his tone made me uneasy, but I nodded and changed lanes to follow his directions. It wasn't entirely unusual for passengers to make unplanned stops or change destinations mid-ride. The app allowed for route adjustments, though his reluctance to use that feature was slightly odd. We exited the main roads and began winding through increasingly isolated streets. The neighborhoods became sparser, with fewer streetlights and more distance between houses. Eventually, we turned onto a narrow road that curved alongside a canyon, dark and removed from the city's glow. "Pull over up ahead," Michael instructed, pointing to a turnout overlooking the canyon. "I need to retrieve something. It won't take long." The location was completely deserted, no houses in sight, no passing cars, just the empty road disappearing into darkness in both directions. My instincts flared with warning. "I'm sorry," I said, maintaining a professional tone, "but company policy doesn't allow me to stop in isolated areas like this. If you need to make a stop, I'd be happy to take you somewhere more populated, a gas station or a store that's still open." Michael fell silent. In the rearview mirror, I could see his face, now expressionless, eyes meeting mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "You misunderstand," he said softly. "This isn't optional. Pull over now." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I was acutely aware of how vulnerable my position was, alone on a deserted road, with a stranger who was now clearly threatening me. Instead of pulling over, I accelerated slightly, keeping my voice steady. "I understand you need to stop, but I can only do so in a safe, public location. There's a 24-hour convenience store about 2 miles ahead. Would that work?" I could see his expression harden in the mirror. He leaned forward, close enough that I could smell expensive cologne, mixed with something metallic. "I said pull over," he repeated, his voice now carrying an unmistakable edge. "Do not make me ask again." In that moment, I made a split-second decision. I pressed the emergency button, hidden on my dashboard, a feature the rideshare company had installed that would alert their security team and share my real-time location. Then I did something that violated every rideshare protocol. I pulled a U-turn and accelerated back toward the main road. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Michael demanded, his carefully composed demeanor cracking. "Taking us back to a populated area," I answered, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I don't feel safe stopping here, and I'm responsible for both our safety." He lunged forward, grabbing the back of my seat. "Turn around now, or you'll regret it." I didn't respond, focusing instead on maintaining control of the vehicle while putting as much distance as possible between us and that isolated turnout. The main road was less than a mile away. If I could just reach it, there would be other cars, businesses, witnesses. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he continued, his voice now frighteningly calm. "I selected you specifically because your profile suggested compliance." Clearly, that was an error in judgment. The way he said, "selected you specifically," made my blood run cold. This wasn't a random passenger who had decided to do something criminal on impulse. This was planned. He had targeted me deliberately. We reached the intersection with the main boulevard, and I turned sharply, merging into late-night traffic. The presence of other vehicles provided immediate relief, though I knew I wasn't safe yet. "I'm terminating this ride," I announced, pulling into the well-lit parking lot of a fast food restaurant where several people were visible through the windows. "Please exit the vehicle." Michael made no move to leave. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, straightening his sweater with deliberate movements. "You've made a significant mistake tonight," he said, his voice once again controlled and professional. "But I'm reasonable. Drive me to my original destination in Venice, and we'll forget this unfortunate detour." "I can't do that," I replied, putting the car in park. "The ride is over." He smiled then, a cold, calculating expression that never reached his eyes. "At least tell me why. What gave me away?" I'm always looking to improve my approach. The casual way he asked this question, as if requesting feedback on a business presentation, rather than what was clearly a thwarted crime, was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire encounter. I didn't answer, instead reaching for my phone to call 911. Seeing this, Michael finally opened the door. "Another time then," he said, stepping out of the car with the same brisk confidence with which he'd entered it an hour earlier. He walked away unhurriedly, disappearing around the corner of the restaurant before I could complete the emergency call. When police arrived 10 minutes later, there was no sign of him in the area. The rideshare company took my report seriously, immediately deactivating Michael's account and launching an investigation. The profile, it turned out, had been created using stolen identity information. The house in the Hollywood Hills where I'd picked him up was a short-term rental property, booked under a false name with fraudulent payment information. The reservation had been made just hours before my pickup, and the real property owner had no knowledge of who had stayed there. Security camera footage from the restaurant parking lot showed Michael walking to a dark sedan with no visible license plates. The vehicle had been positioned strategically, close enough for a quick escape, but just outside the range of the restaurant's high-definition cameras. He had planned every detail meticulously. In the weeks that followed, I learned that I wasn't his first target. 3 other drivers in the Los Angeles area had filed similar reports, all describing a well-dressed, articulate man who had directed them to isolated locations before their instincts or circumstances allowed them to escape. None had ended in violence, but the pattern was clear and deeply troubling. The police added my statement to an ongoing investigation. A detective explained that they believed this person was part of a sophisticated criminal operation targeting rideshare drivers specifically. The isolated locations, the careful selection of drivers, the use of stolen identities and untraceable vehicles, all pointed to something organized and deliberate, not random, opportunistic crime. The canyon location you described has been used before, the detective told me. We've found evidence suggesting it's a drop-off point for something. Based on our current theory, drivers are directed there, forced out of their vehicles at gunpoint or through other threats, and the cars are then used to transport contraband. The drivers themselves, he paused. Well, we haven't had any rideshare drivers reported missing, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. This information haunted me. What had been planned for me that night? What would have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts and driven away? I couldn't continue driving for the rideshare company. The thought of picking up another passenger, of being alone in my car with a stranger, filled me with paralyzing anxiety. I tried twice to resume driving, but each time, panic overtook me before I could even accept a request. I deactivated my account permanently and took on extra shifts at my day job to make up for the lost income. The rideshare company offered counseling services, which I accepted. They also implemented new safety features based partly on my experience. Enhanced emergency response protocols, automatic red flags for destinations in known isolated areas, and driver alerts for passengers creating new accounts with no history. 6 months after my encounter with Michael, the police made a breakthrough. They arrested several members of a criminal network that had been using rideshare drivers unwittingly as part of a complex drug trafficking operation. The scheme involved directing drivers to remote locations where they would be forced to surrender their vehicles, which would then be used to transport drugs across county lines before being abandoned. The drivers themselves were considered disposable, a chilling term used in encrypted messages recovered from the suspects' devices. The man I knew as Michael was never identified or captured. His description matched one of the organization's leaders, a methodical and cautious operator who stayed several steps removed from the actual crimes. According to informants, he personally tested new methodologies before deploying them more widely, explaining why he had been present that night rather than sending one of his associates. Despite the arrests and the knowledge that many lives had likely been saved by disrupting this operation, I've never fully recovered my sense of security. I'm hypervigilant in cars now, whether as a driver or passenger. I maintain strict control over my personal information online and scrutinize rideshare profiles relentlessly when I'm forced to use those services. What stays with me most vividly is not the fear I felt that night, but the calculated nature of the threat. The way Michael spoke, his measured tone, his confidence, his casual inquiry about how he might improve his approach, revealed something more terrifying than impulsive violence. It showed a mind that viewed other humans as simply resources to be utilized, obstacles to be removed, or problems to be solved. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and pass a canyon turnout or an isolated stretch of road, I still feel a phantom chill, wondering how many others have been directed to such places, and how many never made it back to tell their stories. It was just another routine delivery. I had worked as a courier for a specialty logistics company in Baltimore for nearly 3 years, handling everything from rush medical shipments to confidential legal documents. This particular pickup was at a warehouse in an industrial zone on the city's eastern edge, a sprawling complex of identical metal buildings with roll-up doors and minimal signage. The dispatch instructions were slightly unusual. Collect a sealed container from loading dock B, obtain signature verification from the floor supervisor only, and deliver directly to a research facility in Columbia, Maryland. The package was listed as temperature-sensitive materials, which wasn't uncommon in my line of work. Many of our clients were pharmaceutical companies or medical research institutions. I arrived at the warehouse at 2:17 p.m., precisely on schedule. The massive parking lot was nearly empty, just a few scattered vehicles despite the size of the facility. No trucks were being loaded, no workers moving between buildings. The silence was slightly unsettling for what should have been a bustling industrial zone in the middle of a workday. The security booth at the entrance was unmanned, the barrier gate raised. I checked the address again against my manifest and pulled up to the correct building. A small sign reading Dock B confirmed I was in the right place, but there was no activity visible. The loading bay doors were closed, and no lights shone from the small windows running along the upper portion of the warehouse wall. I parked and approached the personnel door adjacent to the loading bay. It opened before I could knock, revealing a thin man in a white lab coat rather than the expected warehouse uniform. He was pale with close-cropped hair and wire-framed glasses, his expression impassive. "Courier service for pickup," I said, presenting my company ID and the digital manifest. "I have instructions to collect a temperature-sensitive package for delivery to Columbia." He studied my credentials without speaking, then nodded slightly. "Wait here," he instructed before disappearing back inside. I stood awkwardly for several minutes, noting the absence of company logos or identifying information anywhere on the building exterior. Most warehouses I delivered to prominently displayed their corporate identity, but this facility was conspicuously anonymous. Eventually, the door opened again. A different man, older, with a gaunt face and deep-set eyes, gestured for me to follow him inside. "The package is prepared. We need final verification before release," he explained, his voice unexpectedly hoarse. "Standard procedure." I hesitated. Protocol typically dictated that packages be brought to the courier at the loading dock or reception area. Entering industrial facilities unnecessarily was discouraged by my company for insurance and liability reasons. But the manifest did specify signature verification from the floor supervisor, which could explain the deviation from standard procedure. "I'm only authorized to accept the package at the loading dock," I replied, maintaining a professional tone. "If you could bring it there with the verification forms, I'd be happy to process the pickup. The man's expression darkened slightly. The verification equipment is calibrated and cannot be moved. Your clearance level allows facility entry for this client. It's noted in your manifest code. I checked the manifest again and noticed a designation I hadn't seen before. Ease 4 clearance required. I wasn't familiar with the code, but assumed it pertained to specialized handling instructions that occasionally accompanied sensitive deliveries. Against my better judgment, I followed him inside. The interior of the warehouse was unexpectedly sterile and organized, not the jumble of boxes and equipment I'd anticipated. The space was divided into sections by clear plastic curtains hanging from ceiling tracks, creating separate chambers throughout the vast room. Bright LED lights illuminated each section with harsh, shadowless clarity. We walked through a central corridor, passing workstations where people in similar white coats worked silently at computers or examined materials I couldn't clearly see. None looked up as we passed. The atmosphere was tense and focused, more like a laboratory than a warehouse. "What exactly does your company store here?" I asked, attempting to break the uncomfortable silence. "Transitional materials," he replied without elaboration, continuing to lead me deeper into the facility. We reached a secure door requiring a keycard and PIN code. My escort entered both, then pressed his palm against a biometric scanner. The door slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss, revealing a smaller room that looked nothing like the rest of the warehouse. The walls were lined with what appeared to be containment units, sealed chambers with thick glass fronts and complex locking mechanisms. Only one was clearly visible from where I stood. The others were obscured by privacy screens. Inside the visible unit was what looked like a large cylindrical container made of some kind of polished metal, surrounded by monitoring equipment. "Wait here," my escort instructed, approaching a workstation where another lab-coated figure was monitoring screens displaying data I couldn't interpret from a distance. They conferred quietly for a moment, occasionally glancing in my direction. Something about their manner, the tense postures, the lowered voices, the furtive looks, triggered warning signals in my mind. This didn't feel like a routine pickup anymore. I took a half step back toward the door we had entered through, casually checking if it had locked behind us. It had. The older man returned, now holding a tablet. "We need confirmation of your biometric identity before proceeding with package transfer. Company protocol." This was definitely not standard procedure for any delivery I'd handled before. My company used digital signatures and occasionally ID verification, but never biometrics. "That's not part of our service agreement," I said firmly. "I'm authorized to accept the package with documentation only. If additional security measures are required, you'll need to contact my dispatcher." His expression didn't change, but I noticed the other lab-coated figures had stopped their work and were now watching our exchange with unsettling intensity. "Perhaps you misunderstand," he said, his tone now colder. "The biometric verification isn't optional for Ease 4 clearance. Your company agreed to these terms when accepting the contract." I pulled out my phone, intending to call my dispatcher for clarification, only to discover there was no signal inside the warehouse. Not even a single bar. "I need to step outside to contact my office," I said, working to keep my voice steady despite the growing sense that something was very wrong here. "That won't be necessary," he replied. "We have a secure line you can use." He gestured toward a door on the far side of the room, away from the entrance we had used. My instincts were now screaming at me to leave immediately. "Actually, I think I'll need to reschedule this pickup," I said, backing toward the main door. "There seems to be some confusion about the protocols, and I'd prefer to get clarification from my supervisor before proceeding." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. The previously indifferent lab workers were now watching me with focused attention. My escort's expression hardened. "I'm afraid the package must be delivered today," he insisted. "The materials are time-sensitive and cannot remain here." I reached the door and tried the handle. As expected, it was locked. "I need you to open this door now," I demanded, abandoning all pretense of politeness. Instead of responding, my escort turned to his colleagues and made a subtle gesture with his hand. Two of them immediately began moving toward me. In that moment of escalation, something unexpected happened. An alarm began blaring throughout the facility, piercing and urgent. Red warning lights flashed from fixtures I hadn't previously noticed mounted near the ceiling. The reaction from the lab workers was immediate and revealing. Their focus shifted from me to the containment units, expressions transforming from controlled calm to something resembling panic. "Containment breach in Section C," announced an automated voice over a PA system. "All personnel implement Protocol 19 immediately." "This is not a drill." My escort swore under his breath, then quickly swiped his keycard against the door lock. "Leave now," he ordered sharply. "Forget this pickup. Go directly to your vehicle and exit the premises." I didn't need to be told twice. As soon as the door unlocked, I pushed through and ran back the way we had come, through the plastic curtained sections toward the main entrance. Behind me, I could hear urgent voices and the sound of equipment being moved. The main warehouse floor was in controlled chaos. Lab workers were rapidly securing equipment and sealing containers. Some were donning what looked like hazmat gear from emergency stations along the walls. I burst through the exit door into the parking lot, sprinting to my delivery van. As I fumbled with the keys, I noticed something alarming. A fine mist was now visible seeping from under one of the loading bay doors, spreading across the concrete like fog. I started the engine and accelerated toward the exit, passing the still unmanned security booth. In my rearview mirror, I saw people in full protective gear emerging from the building, some carrying equipment, others helping colleagues who seemed to be struggling to walk. Once on the main road, I pulled over and finally called my dispatcher, hands shaking as I explained what had happened. She sounded confused, checking her system before informing me that there was no scheduled pickup at that address in our database. "That's impossible," I insisted. "I received the manifest this morning. It was in the system. There's nothing here," she repeated. "What was the client name?" I checked my digital manifest again, only to find that the entire entry had disappeared. There was no record of the pickup ever being scheduled. I drove straight to the nearest police station and reported everything I had witnessed. The officers took my statement, but seemed skeptical, especially when they couldn't find any record of my dispatch in my company's system. They promised to investigate, but warned me that without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. That evening, I drove past the warehouse again, determined to at least get photos of the building as proof of its existence. But when I reached the industrial park, I found the area cordoned off with official vehicles bearing federal government license plates surrounding the facility. Men in dark suits were directing operations, while workers in hazmat suits entered and exited the warehouse. I didn't stop, continuing past as casually as possible, not wanting to draw attention. Whatever had happened in that warehouse, it was now under government control. Over the following weeks, I obsessively checked local news for any reports of industrial accidents or hazardous material leaks in the area. There was nothing. The incident, if acknowledged at all, had been completely suppressed. I soon noticed other strange occurrences. Twice, I spotted black SUVs parked near my apartment complex. My company's HR department called me in for an unexpected performance review, asking pointed questions about my mental health and stress levels. My personal email account showed evidence of login attempts from unknown locations. 3 weeks after the warehouse incident, I was terminated from my job, officially for logistical discrepancies and unauthorized route deviations. The real message was clear: forget what you saw, or there will be consequences. I moved to Pittsburgh shortly after, changing my phone number and minimizing my digital footprint. I found work at a local delivery service using only my first name, keeping a deliberately low profile. Sometimes I wonder what was really happening in that warehouse. What was in the containment units? What breached during the alarm? Was it biological, chemical, or something else entirely? I've researched similar facilities, looking for patterns or explanations, but found nothing conclusive. The only thing I know for certain is that something dangerous was being handled there, something the public wasn't meant to know about, and I came uncomfortably close to becoming involved in its transportation. I still check my rearview mirror more often than necessary, especially when I see unmarked vans or government vehicles. And I no longer accept delivery assignments to industrial zones or research facilities, no matter how routine they might appear. Some packages, I've learned, are better left undelivered. I joined a local historical society in northern Massachusetts to help with my ongoing research about 19th century medical practices. It was supposed to be a straightforward opportunity to access archives and connect with like-minded history enthusiasts while completing my doctoral thesis. The society met twice monthly in a renovated Victorian house that served as their headquarters and museum. Most members were retirees with a passionate interest in preserving local history, cataloging artifacts, and organizing community education events. I was easily the youngest member by 3 decades, but they welcomed me warmly, especially when they learned about my research focus. After my 3rd meeting, Alina, the Society's president and town librarian for over 40 years, approached me with an intriguing proposition. We've recently been granted access to the Westbrook Sanatorium archives, she explained, her eyes bright with excitement. The property's been abandoned since the 60s, but the county has finally approved our request to document the building and its contents before demolition next month. We could use someone with your medical history background on the exploration team. The Westbrook Sanatorium had been mentioned occasionally in my research, a mental health facility built in the 1870s that operated until 1962, when changing treatment methods and financial troubles forced its closure. The building had sat abandoned on the outskirts of town ever since, gradually deteriorating, while ownership disputes and preservation efforts kept it in bureaucratic limbo. "We'll be going this Saturday," Alina continued. "It'll be myself, Robert from Architectural Preservation, and Thomas, who handles our photography. The county's only giving us 3 days total, so we need to make this first visit count." I agreed immediately. The opportunity to explore untouched archives from a 19th century mental institution was too valuable to pass up. Alina seemed delighted, promising to email logistical details and safety protocols. Saturday arrived with appropriate atmospheric conditions, overcast skies, and a light fog that shrouded the landscape in muted gray. We met at the Historical Society building before driving in Thomas's SUV to the sanatorium property, about 20 minutes outside town. The facility appeared suddenly through the mist as we rounded a bend in the long access road. A massive Victorian structure of red brick and stone with multiple wings extending from a central administrative building. Decorative turrets and elaborate stonework spoke to the era's architectural grandeur, though decades of neglect had transformed this once impressive design into something ominous and foreboding. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth. Ivy crawled unchecked across entire sections of facade. The surrounding grounds had reverted to wild forest, with saplings pushing through cracked pathways and ornamental gardens long since surrendered to nature's reclamation. "Magnificent, isn't it?" murmured Robert, an architectural historian in his 70s with wire-rimmed glasses and meticulous dress. "They don't build with this kind of craftsmanship anymore." We parked near what had once been the main entrance, gathering our equipment, cameras, notebooks, flashlights, and protective gear, including masks and gloves. Alina retrieved a massive ring of keys from her bag, obtained from the county administrator, specifically for our approved visit. "Remember," she cautioned as we approached the imposing entrance, "we're here to document, not disturb. The building hasn't been structurally assessed in years, so watch for weak floors and falling debris. Stay together, and if anyone feels uncomfortable, we leave immediately, no questions asked." The massive oak doors groaned in protest as Alina unlocked and pushed them open, revealing a grand foyer thick with dust and draped in cobwebs. Weak daylight filtered through dirty windows and holes in the roof, creating dappled patterns on the once elegant marble floor. A sweeping staircase curved upward to the second level, its ornate banister still intact despite years of abandonment. Thomas immediately began photographing the entrance hall, while Robert examined architectural details, making notes about the building's construction. Alina consulted a faded blueprint, orienting herself. "The administrative offices should be through here," she said, pointing down a corridor to our right. "That's where we're most likely to find records and documentation. The patient wings are in the east and west extensions, and medical facilities were primarily in the basement level." The administrative wing was in better condition than I had expected. Dust-covered desks still held ancient typewriters and office supplies. Filing cabinets stood in neat rows, many still stuffed with papers. It was as if everyone had simply walked out one day and never returned, leaving everything frozen in time. I began carefully examining the files, finding patient intake forms, staff records, and institutional correspondence dating back decades. The historical value was extraordinary. A complete, untouched archive of psychiatric practices spanning nearly a century. "This is remarkable," I said, carefully photographing documents for later study. Some of these records go back to the 1880s. The institutional practices, treatment methodologies, patient demographics, it's all here. Alina nodded, her gloved hands gently turning pages in a ledger. The county administrator mentioned that when they closed, there was some legal dispute about patient records. Everything was supposed to be transferred to state archives, but the process was never completed. That's why all this is still here. We worked systematically through the administrative section for several hours, documenting everything of historical significance. The atmosphere was academic, professional. The initial unease of entering the abandoned building replaced by scholarly focus. It was Robert who first suggested exploring beyond our planned areas. "The sun won't set for another few hours," he noted, checking his watch. "We've thoroughly documented the administration wing. Perhaps we should at least survey some of the other sections while we're here. Get a sense of what we'll need to focus on during our next visits." Alina hesitated, consulting her blueprint again. "I suppose a preliminary walkthrough wouldn't hurt." The east wing contained female patients, west was male, and the north wing was for the most severe cases. She traced the paths with her finger. "We should avoid the basement and upper floors until we can better assess structural integrity." We agreed to conduct a brief exploration of the ground floor of the east wing. Thomas led the way with his camera, followed by Alina, then myself, with Robert bringing up the rear. The corridor connecting the administrative section to the patient wing was long and grew progressively darker as we moved away from the windows of the main building. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly as we entered the east wing. The administrative areas had felt merely abandoned, but this section carried a heavier emotional residue. Patient rooms lined both sides of a central corridor, small, cell-like spaces with heavy doors, many still bearing name cards in tarnished brass holders. They would have had about 60 patients in this wing, Alina explained, her voice hushed as if concerned about disturbing someone. Mostly women with diagnoses like hysteria, melancholia, or moral insanity, terms used to pathologize everything from depression to socially unacceptable behavior. I peered into one of the rooms. A rusted metal bed frame remained bolted to the floor, with rotting leather restraints still attached to its sides. Faded floral wallpaper peeled from damp walls, and a small barred window provided the only natural light. The space was suffocatingly small, barely room for the bed and a nightstand. "Look at this," Thomas called from further down the hall. He was photographing what appeared to be a day room, a larger space where patients would presumably have spent their waking hours. Dusty board games and jigsaw puzzles, with missing pieces, remained on shelves along one wall. Chairs were arranged in a circle, as if waiting for a therapy session that would never begin. Robert had wandered ahead, his architectural interest clearly piqued by the building's construction. "These interior walls are solid brick," he called back. 18 inches thick in some sections. "They built this place like a fortress." I was examining a glass-fronted medication cabinet when I first heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere down the corridor. At first, I assumed it was Robert or Thomas, perhaps testing a wall or surface. But when I looked up, I could see all three of my companions in the day room, gathered around something Thomas was photographing. The tapping continued, 3 quick taps, a pause, then 3 more. Deliberate, not the random noise of settling architecture or wildlife. "Did you hear that?" I asked, rejoining the group. They looked up, confused. "Hear what?" Alina asked. "That tapping sound, like someone knocking." We all fell silent, listening. For several seconds, nothing. Then it came again. The same pattern, slightly louder, seemingly from further down the hallway toward the northern wing. "Old buildings make all kinds of noises," Robert said dismissively, though he straightened up from his examination of the baseboard molding. "Thermal expansion and contraction, animals whined through broken windows." That sounded. "Deliberate," Thomas said quietly, lowering his camera. Alina consulted her blueprint again. The northeast corner connected to the severe ward. It would have housed patients with more advanced conditions, often kept in isolation. The tapping came again, unmistakably clearer. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more. A chill ran through me as I realized it sounded like an intentional signal, perhaps even Morse code for SOS. Without discussion, we moved toward the sound, our scholarly curiosity overriding caution. The corridor grew darker as we progressed. The windows here boarded up or bricked over, an architectural reminder of the patient's increased restriction of movement and access to the outside world. The northeast connecting corridor ended at a heavy metal door with a small, wire-reinforced window at eye level. A sign above read, "North Wing, authorized personnel only." The tapping was definitely coming from beyond this door. "This section isn't on our approved exploration route," Alina said hesitantly. "The blueprints show significant structural damage in the north wing. It might not be safe." As if in response, the tapping intensified, louder, more urgent. "Someone could be trapped," Thomas suggested, though his expression suggested he didn't entirely believe it. "Teenagers break into these places all the time." "Or it could be a structural issue we're misinterpreting," Robert added. "A loose pipe knocking against a wall, perhaps." Alina stood silently for a moment, then reached for her ring of keys. "We'll take a quick look. If there's someone in there who needs help, we can't just ignore it. But we stay together, and at the first sign of danger, we leave immediately." She tried several keys before finding one that fit the lock. The door opened with surprising ease, swinging inward to reveal a corridor almost identical to the one we stood in, except for one critical difference. While dust covered every surface in the east wing, the floor of the north wing appeared recently disturbed, with clear footprints visible in the decades of accumulated grime. Thomas photographed the footprints before we proceeded. They appeared to belong to a single individual wearing what looked like institutional footwear, perhaps hospital slippers or thin-soled shoes. The tapping had stopped the moment Alina unlocked the door. Now an unsettling silence enveloped us as we cautiously entered the north wing. Our flashlight beams cut through the gloom, revealing a corridor lined with heavily reinforced doors. Not simple rooms like in the East Wing, but what appeared to be isolation cells with small observation windows and complicated locking mechanisms. This would have been for the most severely disturbed patients, Alina whispered, as if afraid of being overheard. Treatment methods in these wards were often experimental and rarely humane by modern standards. The footprints we were following led directly to a door at the far end of the corridor. Unlike the others, this one stood slightly ajar, a thin slice of darkness visible through the opening. We approached slowly, our earlier academic confidence replaced by growing apprehension. The air felt noticeably colder here, with a damp, medicinal smell that hadn't been present in the other sections. Thomas raised his camera to document the door, but lowered it almost immediately. "Battery's dead," he muttered, checking the display. "That's strange. I charged it fully this morning." Robert stepped forward, gently pushing the door wider with his flashlight. It opened into what appeared to be a treatment room. Ancient medical equipment stood in the center. An examination chair with leather restraints, surrounded by trays of rusted instruments. Cabinets lined the walls, their glass fronts revealing bottles of chemicals long since crystallized or evaporated. The footprints led directly to the examination chair, where they simply stopped. "This makes no sense," I said, examining the floor carefully. "It's as if whoever made these prints just vanished." A sudden drop in temperature made my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight. The cold was localized, centered around the examination chair, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. Alina's flashlight flickered, then went out completely. She shook it in frustration. "The batteries were new," she murmured, an edge of fear now evident in her voice. Robert's light began to dim next, the beam weakening by the second. "We should leave," he said firmly. "Whatever's happening, I don't think we should be here." Before anyone could respond, a sound came from the examination chair, the same tapping pattern we'd followed, but this time it seemed to emanate from the metal frame itself, as if someone were tapping the armrest with their fingers. But there was no one there, nothing visible that could create such a sound. Thomas's flashlight failed next, leaving only mine illuminating the increasingly cold room. In the narrow beam, I could now see that the leather restraints on the chair were moving slightly, flexing and contracting, as if recently released from holding someone in place. "We need to go." Now, Alina's voice was tight with controlled fear. She backed toward the door, gesturing for us to follow. As we retreated, my flashlight, the last one still functioning, began to flicker. In the strobe-like effect of the failing light, I caught glimpses of something forming in the examination chair. Not a solid presence, but a disturbance in the air, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. The outline of a human form seemed to take shape for split seconds between flashes of darkness. We backed out of the room as my flashlight finally died, plunging us into near-complete darkness. Only faint gray light filtered in from distant windows at the far end of the corridor. We moved quickly toward it, no longer concerned with documenting or exploring, focused solely on reaching the exit. The tapping followed us, not from behind, but seemingly from all around, emanating from the walls themselves. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more. Over and over, growing louder and more insistent with each repetition. We reached the metal door separating the north wing from the east wing, only to find it closed, though Alina was certain she had left it propped open with a doorstop. She fumbled with her keys, hands shaking as she tried to find the right one. "Hurry," Thomas urged, his voice barely above a whisper. The temperature continued to drop, frost now visibly forming on the metal door and spreading across the walls. My teeth chattered uncontrollably as the cold penetrated my jacket and gloves. Alina finally located the correct key and unlocked the door. We burst through into the relative warmth of the east wing, not stopping until we had reached the main entrance hall. Only then did we pause, catching our breath, looking at each other with the shared understanding that what we had experienced defied rational explanation. "We're leaving," Alina announced, her usual composure visibly shaken. "We'll report to the county that the north wing is structurally unsound and should be avoided during future visits." No one argued. We gathered our equipment in silence, deliberately avoiding discussion of what we had witnessed. It wasn't until we were in Thomas's SUV, driving away from the sanatorium, that Robert finally spoke. "Did anyone else notice the date on that patient register we found?" The last entry I had, the final page of the admission ledger, had recorded a patient intake on June 17, 1962, more than a week after the sanatorium had officially closed, according to all historical records. The patient's diagnosis was listed simply as unresponsive catatonia, with a note that they had been assigned to isolation therapy in the north wing. There was no discharge date recorded. We completed our documentation project over the next 2 scheduled visits, but we worked exclusively in the administrative wing and the less restrictive patient areas. By unspoken agreement, none of us approached the north wing again. We filed our reports with the county, recommending that the architectural and historical elements worth preserving be carefully removed before demolition. 3 weeks later, as scheduled, the Westbrook Sanatorium was razed to the ground. The site was cleared for a future commercial development. The building's troubled history reduced to rubble and eventually paved over. I completed my doctoral thesis and moved away from Massachusetts shortly afterward, accepting a teaching position at a university in another state. I've never shared the full details of what happened in the North Wing with anyone outside our small exploration group. Sometimes, though, especially in the quiet hours before dawn, I wake to the sound of tapping, 3 quick taps, a pause, then 3 more. A call for help that arrived decades too late, from someone who was forgotten by history and abandoned by those who should have cared for them. And in those moments, I wonder if some emotional residue, some echo of human suffering, can imprint itself so deeply on a place that it continues to resonate long after the walls have crumbled and the rooms have been reduced to memory. I wonder if, beneath the asphalt of whatever now stands on that site, something still waits in the darkness, tapping out its plea for rescue, for recognition, for someone to acknowledge that they existed at all. I was enjoying a quiet weekend alone at my cabin in the Vermont woods when my girlfriend Ellie decided to surprise me with a visit. It was the middle of October, and the fall colors were at their peak, creating a picturesque but somewhat eerie atmosphere around the isolated property. Ellie suggested we have a horror movie marathon that evening to embrace the Halloween spirit. We ordered pizza from the only place that delivered this far out, opened a bottle of whiskey, and settled in front of the fireplace. We started with the Blair Witch Project, and then queued up Hereditary for our second feature. When we finished the whiskey, I decided to make a quick trip to the small liquor store about 3 miles down the mountain road. It would be a quick drive, no more than 20 minutes round trip. Despite it being almost 9 in the evening, the store would still be open since it was Friday, and the owner always stayed late for weekend customers. When I arrived, I found Tom, the same clerk who'd been running the place for decades. As usual, we fell into easy conversation about the upcoming winter season and whether we'd get an early snow. In the middle of our chat, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. It was Ellie. I excused myself. "One moment, please," I said to Tom. When I answered, I could tell immediately that something was wrong. Ellie's voice was tight with tension. As she explained, she was hearing strange noises coming from beneath the floor, specifically from the crawl space under the cabin. "Stay calm, it's probably nothing," I tried to reassure her. But Ellie insisted I stay on the phone with her until I got back. I agreed and started driving immediately, maintaining our conversation while she remained frozen on the couch with the movie paused, listening intently for any sound. "Have you heard anything else?" I asked as I navigated the winding road. "No, but what if there's some animal down there?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "That's impossible. The crawl space is completely sealed from the outside," I guaranteed, though in truth, I couldn't be entirely certain. The cabin had been in my family for 3 generations, and I'd never fully inspected every corner of the foundation. Back at the cabin, I opened the new bottle of whiskey, and we tried to resume watching the movie. Not 15 minutes later, we both heard a dull thud, like something heavy shifting underneath us. I looked at Ellie, who returned my gaze with wide eyes. Something was definitely down there. "Maybe it is some animal after all," I admitted. We paused the movie again. I went to the utility closet where the access hatch to the crawl space was located, grabbed a flashlight, and descended the rickety wooden ladder. The beam of light cut through the dusty darkness, revealing stacks of old furniture and boxes that had accumulated over the years. Any small creature could easily hide among them. The unmistakable smell of urine confirmed that something had indeed taken residence there. This wasn't my area of expertise, so I texted my cousin, who lived about an hour away, asking if he knew any pest control companies that serviced properties this remote. As I was climbing back up the ladder, I heard movement from the far corner of the crawl space, something much larger than a raccoon or possum. My heart raced at the thought of a bear or something equally dangerous lunging toward me. I scrambled up the remaining rungs, slammed the hatch shut, and secured the lock. There was nothing more we could do tonight, except try to enjoy the rest of our evening. After Hereditary ended, we went to bed, both of us trying to convince ourselves it was just some woodland creature seeking shelter. I woke sometime around 3 in the morning with a splitting headache and a full bladder. I opened the bedroom door and peered down the dark hallway. At the end of it, illuminated only by the faint moonlight streaming through a window, I saw the silhouette of a person. My instinct was to close the door slowly and lock it, Moments later, I heard footsteps approaching and the doorknob turning. Someone was trying to get in. Then a hoarse, deep voice spoke from the other side. "I know you're awake." Ellie began screaming, awakened by the noise and my panicked reaction. I couldn't say anything to calm her, because terror had paralyzed me. On the other side of the door, I heard footsteps retreating. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The wait for the sheriff's deputy to arrive felt eternal, as if time itself had stopped. When 2 officers finally entered the cabin, there was no sign of anybody. Whoever had been there was gone. But something confirmed my suspicions had been correct. The smell of urine in the crawlspace wasn't my imagination. There was literally a makeshift bed set up, indicating someone had probably been hiding there for quite some time. Empty food wrappers and water bottles suggested they'd been living under my cabin for days, maybe weeks. Everything pointed to someone who had been watching the cabin, waiting for an opportunity. The deputies suggested it might be a fugitive hiding from the law, as there had been a prison break at the county facility, about 70 miles away 3 weeks earlier. This information didn't make the experience any less terrifying. When I told my family about it later, they were skeptical at first, until the sheriff's department confirmed they found fingerprints matching one of the escaped inmates. They never caught the person, and to this day, I still wonder if they're out there somewhere. Since that night, I've never failed to check that every door and window is locked before going to sleep. And I've installed motion sensor floodlights around the entire perimeter of the cabin. The crawlspace now has a reinforced door with 3 separate locks. Sometimes when I'm alone at the cabin and the wind howls through the trees, I still find myself listening for sounds coming from below, wondering if someone is watching, waiting for me to let my guard down again. It was October of 2018 when everything happened. My wife and I were living in a craftsman-style house we'd purchased together in a small New England town. It was a charming neighborhood with towering maple trees that blazed with color in the fall. Exactly the kind of place where you'd want to raise children. That's what made what happened 3 years ago all the more disturbing. We knew our immediate neighbors fairly well. The elderly couple to our left, the young family across the street, and Richard, the man who lived alone in the Victorian house to our right. They were all pleasant in that distinctly New England way, friendly but respectful of privacy. But as I've come to learn, you never truly know what darkness someone might be harboring behind closed doors. Richard was always cordial when we crossed paths, though he kept to himself. He was somewhere in his late 30s, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of face you'd forget minutes after seeing it. I'd occasionally spot him coming or going, presumably to his job, though I never knew what he did for a living. He was just Richard from next door, unremarkable in every way. That autumn, I realized I hadn't seen Richard for about a week. His navy blue Volvo remained parked in the driveway, which wasn't necessarily concerning. The fall chill had set in early that year, and most houses on our street, including Richard's, were already decorated with Halloween displays. I always found it curious how he, a single man approaching 40, took such pride in his elaborate decorations. His front yard featured an impressive array of carved pumpkins that were illuminated by string lights wrapped around his porch railings and columns. One evening, while raking leaves in our front yard, I noticed something odd about Richard's Halloween lights. They were flickering erratically, not in the intentional spooky pattern you might expect for the season, but in a disjointed, frantic way that suggested an electrical malfunction. It wasn't just one section. The entire display was blinking chaotically. The next morning, as I left for work, I observed that Richard's car was still in the driveway, and all the blinds in his house remained drawn. When I returned that evening, nothing had changed, except the Halloween lights were on again. I mentioned to my wife, half jokingly, that Richard must be in some kind of seasonal hibernation. Later that night, my wife came into our living room with a concerned look. "Those lights at Richard's are flickering wildly again," she said. I went to our front window to see for myself. Sure enough, the lights were pulsing erratically, just as they had the night before. The pattern seemed too irregular to be intentional, more like a cry for help than a festive display. I decided to walk over and let him know, while also checking if everything was all right, since I hadn't seen him in some time. I knocked on his door. No answer. I rang the doorbell and waited, but there was no response. With all the blinds closed tight, I couldn't tell if any lights were on inside. I pressed the doorbell a second time, and finally I heard movement. Richard opened the door just enough to show his face. He looked disheveled, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes. I explained about the flickering lights, but as I spoke, I realized they had suddenly stopped. He thanked me with a tight smile and said he hadn't noticed anything unusual. I asked if he was feeling okay, since I hadn't seen him around lately. He replied that he'd been under the weather, but there was something off about him. He seemed jumpy, his eyes darting past me to scan the street. That's when I heard it, a sound from inside the house. For a moment, I thought my imagination was playing tricks on me, but no, it was unmistakable. A muffled cry that sounded like a child calling for help. Richard had no children. He lived alone. My blood ran cold, but I managed to keep my expression neutral, simply nodding and saying I hoped he'd feel better soon. As soon as I was back in my house, I turned to my wife and said, "Call the police right now. I think Richard has a child in there." She looked at me in disbelief. "What did you just say?" I repeated. "I think Richard has kidnapped a child." I decided to make the call myself. I reported what I'd heard to the police dispatcher. What sounded like a child's cry coming from my neighbor's house, a man who lived alone and hadn't been seen outside for at least a week or two. I requested that my name be kept confidential, though I knew Richard would likely figure out I was the one who called. Within 30 minutes, police officers arrived. They entered Richard's house with an emergency warrant, and what they discovered was horrifying. In a hidden room beneath the stairs, they found a girl no more than 9 years old. She had been there for 6 days, taken from a town nearly 200 miles away. As for the flickering Halloween lights, the little girl had ingeniously found a way to manipulate the electrical connection from inside her prison. It was her desperate attempt to signal anyone who might be passing by. Perhaps each time she spotted someone through a tiny crack in the wall, she tried to send her message. When she saw me outside, she must have seized the opportunity to cry for help. The intelligence and survival instinct of that child astounds me to this day. I was relieved to learn that she was reunited with her family. I can't begin to imagine the trauma she endured in that house, but I pray with all my heart that she finds healing and happiness as she grows up. Based on the severity of his crimes, Richard won't see freedom for decades, if ever. Sometimes when I look at our once peaceful neighborhood, I'm reminded that evil can hide in the most ordinary places, behind the most unremarkable faces. And sometimes, salvation comes in the simple form of flickering lights that someone chooses not to ignore. It was the first week of July 2019 when my partner Charlotte and I decided to escape the city heat. We had reserved a lakeside cabin through Vacasa that looked absolutely perfect, rustic, yet modern, sitting on the shores of Lake Champlain in Vermont. The property was decorated with a charming summer theme, featuring string lights along the deck railing, colorful Adirondack chairs facing the water, and wildflower gardens surrounding the pathway. The grounds were spacious, and the house was located near a quaint village that promised fresh farmers markets and local craft shops. The setting promised to become even more magical, since perfect weather was forecast for our stay, warm days, with gentle breezes and clear, starry nights. We left Boston early that Friday morning to ensure we'd have enough time for grocery shopping and settling in before sunset. The drive to northern Vermont took about 5 hours, and the journey was pleasant. We made a stop at a local co-op market to buy fresh produce, local cheeses, craft beers, and some homemade pastries before heading directly to our destination. The final stretch of our journey took us down a winding gravel road that meandered through dense maple forests before opening up to reveal the lakefront property. The cabin, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees, had a wraparound porch with a wood-fired hot tub overlooking the water, something that seemed perfect for evenings under the stars. The exterior was adorned with twinkling fairy lights strung between trees, colorful garden lanterns lining the stone path, and a collection of vibrant potted flowers arranged near the entrance. We made several trips between the car and the house to unload everything. The first impression confirmed our expectations. It was a comfortable place, just as shown in the photos. In the corner of the living room stood a handcrafted wooden bookcase filled with local guidebooks and novels. The walls were decorated with landscape paintings by local artists and several intricate dream catchers that swayed gently with the breeze coming through the open windows. The subtle scent of cedar and pine gave it that special touch you'd expect from a cabin, though the house was actually more modern and well-appointed than rustic. In one corner of the living room, a stack of firewood was positioned next to a large stone fireplace that dominated the wall. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, but we only needed one. We left our bags in the master bedroom, and as usual, I went exploring. I checked the refrigerator, tested the television to see what streaming services were available, and peered through the various windows. On the upper level, there was a loft with a pool table and some board games, and in the basement, I went down to see. It was a larger space than I had imagined, considering the cozy appearance of the property above. The basement was somewhat uninviting, dark and cool, with the feel of a workshop and laundry area. While I was down there, I heard a knock at the front door. I quickly came upstairs and found a man appearing to be in his mid-30s, wearing khaki shorts and a faded blue and green plaid shirt. He flashed a broad smile and said, "Everything all right in there?" I replied that yes, everything was fine, and asked if he was responsible for the Vacasa property. He explained that he looked after the place, along with his brother. I asked his name, and he introduced himself as Jake. He mentioned that he lived just up the hill in the neighboring house, and that we could call him if we needed anything. I thanked him and he left. I found it curious that he seemed to know I was with my girlfriend, since Charlotte hadn't come to the door. Perhaps his brother, Daniel, who I had communicated with during the booking process, had mentioned something about us. I had commented during our exchange that we were looking for a peaceful lakeside retreat. It was early evening now. The sun was beginning to set over the lake, casting long golden reflections across the water. We turned on some soft music to fill the space while we prepared dinner: grilled salmon, fresh asparagus, wild rice, and crusty sourdough bread. A feast worthy of our vacation setting. We ate on the deck, with the string lights twinkling overhead, creating a magical atmosphere as twilight deepened around us. After dinner, we opened a bottle of local wine and put on a classic summer movie, The Way Back. One of the few decent summer-themed films we could find on the streaming service. In case it wasn't clear, we're really into seasonal experiences, embracing whatever time of year it is. After watching the movie and giving the food time to settle, we decided to try out the wood-fired hot tub on the deck. Before that, I lit all the lanterns and string lights in the yard. Sitting in the hot tub, watching fireflies dance in the darkness and the stars reflecting on the lake's surface, the moment seemed perfect, almost surreal, until suddenly the crackling of the fire beneath the tub seemed to diminish, and the water began cooling rapidly. The resulting silence revealed something unexpected: the clear sound of footsteps around the property. Charlotte and I exchanged worried glances. I whispered, "Should I call out to see who's there?" "No, don't even think about it," she replied urgently. The footsteps gradually faded away until they disappeared completely. I tried to reassure her, suggesting it might be a deer wandering around, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Those footsteps had the unmistakable weight and rhythm of a person. After that unsettling experience, we went back inside to shower before bed. However, the hot water lasted less than 3 minutes before turning ice cold. As soon as it became freezing, we both yelped and jumped out of the shower. I grabbed my phone and sent a message to Daniel, the host, reporting the problem. He responded about half an hour later, saying it was strange, and that he would send someone to check the water heater the next day. We ended up going to sleep after that improvised cold shower. In the middle of the night, we were awakened by loud knocking at the front door. Charlotte, terrified, shook me awake. "I'll go see who it is," I mumbled. "No, stay here and don't make any noise," she insisted. In truth, I was relieved she said that. The last thing I wanted was to confront whoever was making that sound in the middle of the night. The knocking came in 3 series, loud and aggressive, before ceasing completely. We remained motionless, nervously whispering to each other. I got up, went to the bedroom door, and locked it, as if that would protect us. The minutes dragged on until, after about 30 minutes of absolute silence, we managed to fall asleep again. In the morning, I sent another message to Daniel reporting what had happened. He seemed as confused as we were, saying it was really strange and that if it happened again, we should call the police. It wasn't exactly a reassuring response, but it made sense. What else could he suggest? Something like, stay armed and shoot anyone who appears at the door. Despite the discomfort, I didn't want to press the issue and seem difficult. Outside, the scenery was idyllic. The lake was mirror calm, reflecting the surrounding trees and mountains under a bright blue sky. I went out to inspect the hot tub and noticed footprints around the cabin. I thought about the knocking from the night before and wondered if they belonged to the same person. However, these tracks seemed fresh, and with the heavy dew that had fallen overnight, any footprints from yesterday should have been less defined. It was then that I heard footsteps approaching from behind me. It was Jake, emerging from the path that led down from the neighboring property. I explained the hot water problem and mentioned that Daniel had promised to send someone. He confirmed that he knew about the issue and was there specifically to check the water heater. I took the opportunity to comment on the knocking at the door and the footprints around the property. I even showed him the marks. Jake looked at them carefully and said, "There are some strange folks around here who like to wander at night." I asked if we should avoid using the hot tub in the evening. "No need to worry. The people around here are harmless," he replied confidently. Jake entered the house without hesitation, made a brief inspection, and went down to the basement, saying he would check the water heater. He had an odd manner that was difficult to ignore. I decided to send a message to Daniel, letting him know that Jake was there solving the problem. Daniel's response left me cold. "Jake." "Who's Jake?" Confused, I immediately replied, "Your brother, the one who manages the Vacasa property with you." But Daniel's response was even more disturbing. "What are you talking about? I don't have a brother." It felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. The realization hit me hard. I wrote again, trying to confirm. "You don't have a brother named Jake who helps take care of the property with you." Daniel categorically denied it and asked me who this person was. I ran to Charlotte, trying not to panic, and whispered that we needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I asked her to pack everything silently. Within minutes, we threw our belongings into the car without worrying about being organized. I'm sure we forgot something, maybe a charger or some small item, but that was irrelevant at that moment. As soon as I got into the SUV and started the engine, I looked in the rearview mirror and my heart nearly stopped. Jake was coming toward us, walking rapidly toward the back of the car. I didn't think twice. I shifted into gear and accelerated, leaving the property behind as fast as I could. Once on the main road, still trembling, we called Daniel and explained everything, insisting that he call the police immediately. The call was brief, but about 20 minutes later, while we were still driving around the area trying to calm ourselves, Daniel called us back. He said the police had arrived at the house, but found no one there. He was also on his way to the property and wanted more details about what had happened. After a few hours wandering around the area to recover our nerves, we decided to head back to Boston. Later that same night, Daniel sent another message apologizing for the incident. He emphasized that he didn't know anyone matching Jake's description and had no idea who it could be. What bothers me most about this whole experience is thinking that this man was watching us the entire time. From the moment we arrived until we were in the hot tub, He was nearby throughout, and it was probably him who knocked on the door during the night. I can't even imagine what his intentions were. I only know that leaving quickly was the best decision we could have made. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear knocking at my door. And every time I consider booking a remote cabin for a vacation, I remember those footsteps circling around us in the darkness, and I choose a busy hotel instead. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.